Welcome to War's Sleep Stories. Today we'll be listening to 4 relaxing, true war stories to make you fall asleep.
Operation Silver, a Cold War espionage saga. The streets of post-war Vienna bore the scars of conflict, their paths lined with whispers of alliances and betrayals. It was 1949, and Austria, carved into occupation zones, had become a chessboard for the great powers. In this city, where shadows moved faster than light, the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, launched a covert operation that would come to define the era. Operation Silver was born, a daring scheme to intercept Soviet communications beneath the very heart of their stronghold. This is the story of an intricate web of tunnels, hidden agendas, and the brave men and women who risked everything in the silent war of espionage. The idea for Operation Silver germinated in the smoke-filled rooms of British intelligence headquarters. Peter Lunn, a sharp-witted SIS officer stationed in Vienna, had spent months observing Soviet movements. The Soviets had established their headquarters in a stately building in Schwechat, a quiet suburb outside Vienna. Beneath this facade lay a vulnerability, a direct landline to Moscow. The possibility of tapping this lifeline sparked the imagination of Lunn and his colleague, Major John Edward Wyke. Lunn and Wyke's initial plans were ambitious and fraught with challenges. They needed a secure base of operations near the Soviet headquarters, specialized equipment, and experts capable of engineering a tunnel without detection. The British Post Office research station at Dollis Hill was enlisted, bringing in telecommunication specialists who could decode the intricacies of Soviet signals. As the pieces of the puzzle began to align, Operation Silver moved from an audacious idea to a meticulously planned mission. The operation required a discreet location close to the Soviet headquarters. Major Wyke, with his military precision and an eye for detail, found the perfect spot, a villa in Schwechat. To the casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than a quaint suburban home. In reality, it would become the gateway to a hidden world of espionage. Beneath the villa, workers began digging a tunnel. The team operated under strict secrecy, often working at night to avoid drawing attention. The noise of their labor was muffled by carefully placed soundproofing materials, and the excavated soil was discreetly transported out of the area. Every step was calculated to ensure the Soviets remained oblivious to the audacious plot unfolding just meters away. To further cloak their activities, the British established a front, a quaint shop selling tweed clothing. The shop's innocuous facade masked the entrance to a sophisticated monitoring station. Inside, the team's telecommunication experts worked tirelessly to develop the technology needed to intercept Soviet communications. The operation required not only technical expertise but also a deep understanding of Soviet communication protocols. Meanwhile, Peter Montagnan, another key SIS officer, coordinated intelligence efforts with the Americans. The CIA, impressed by the ingenuity of Operation Silver, sought to replicate its success in Berlin with a joint venture named Operation Gold. Despite the cooperation, the British maintained tight control over their operation, aware that even the smallest leak could spell disaster. Unknown to the SIS team, their meticulous planning was compromised from within. George Blake, a trusted member of British intelligence, had been turned by the KGB. In October 1953, Blake provided the Soviets with detailed information about Operation Silver. The KGB, however, chose to keep the operation's existence a secret to protect their prized double agent. For the British, the stakes could not have been higher. The tunnel beneath Schwechat became not only a conduit for Soviet secrets but also a symbol of the precarious balance between triumph and treachery. As the years passed, the tunnel's existence remained undiscovered, a testament to the ingenuity and daring of the men and women who risked everything to uncover the enemy's plans. The Schwechat tunnel grew steadily, inch by inch, as the team of engineers and laborers toiled in the dark. They worked with an urgency tempered by caution, aware that even the faintest sound could attract suspicion. The men had developed a rhythming, reinforce, and dispose of the soil. The villa's basement became a hive of activity, its walls bearing witness to the determination and ingenuity of its occupants. Above ground, Major Wyke maintained the facade of a quiet suburban life. Neighbors often saw him tending to the villa's garden, offering friendly waves and idle chatter to deflect any suspicions. Meanwhile, Peter Lund coordinated efforts from a distance, ensuring that the operation's progress remained on track. Every decision, every action, was calculated to avoid detection. The work was grueling and fraught with challenges. Unexpected obstacles, such as underground water channels and shifting soil, threatened to derail the mission. Yet, the team's resilience and resourcefulness ensured that progress continued. As the tunnel stretched closer to the Soviet headquarters, the tension among the operatives grew palpable. In the summer of 1950, after months of labor, the tunnel reached its destination. The team installed sophisticated listening devices along the Soviet landlines, connecting them to the monitoring station disguised as the Tweed shop. For the first time, British intelligence could eavesdrop on the inner workings of the Soviet military command. The voices that filtered through the headphones were a mix of curt commands and casual conversations. Translators worked tirelessly to decode the messages, their expertise crucial in extracting valuable intelligence. The intercepted communications revealed troop movements, strategic plans, and hints of Soviet intentions in the region. Every scrap of information was meticulously documented and relayed to SIS headquarters in London. For Peter Montagnan, who oversaw the intelligence analysis, the success of the operation was both exhilarating and sobering. The information gleaned from the tunnel provided a rare glimpse into the Soviet mindset, but it also underscored the fragility of their position. The knowledge that a single mistake could expose the entire operation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The success of Operation Silver caught the attention of the CIA. Recognizing its potential, the Americans proposed a joint operation to replicate the tunnel's achievements in Berlin. Thus, Operation Gold was born, an ambitious plan to tap into Soviet communications in the divided city. The collaboration between the British and American intelligence agencies was both a boon and a challenge. While the pooling of resources enhanced their capabilities, it also introduced new complexities. The Americans, eager to assert their dominance, often clashed with their British counterparts over operational details. Peter Lund, tasked with maintaining the partnership, navigated these tensions with a mix of diplomacy and determination. The new operation drew heavily from the expertise developed in Vienna. Engineers and telecommunication specialists from Operation Silver were brought to Berlin to lend their skills. As construction on the Berlin Tunnel began, the operatives in Vienna continued their work, their efforts now part of a broader strategy against the Soviet threat. By 1953, Operation Silver had become a cornerstone of British intelligence efforts. The intercepted communications provided insights that shaped Cold War strategies, influencing decisions at the highest levels of government. Yet, the operation's success was tempered by the constant specter of betrayal. George Blake's treachery, though still hidden from the British, had already compromised the operation. The KGB, privy to the tunnel's existence, chose to let it continue to maintain Blake's cover. This calculated decision created a dangerous illusion of security for the British operatives. For Major White, Peter Lunn, and their team, the work remained relentless. The tunnel's maintenance required constant vigilance, and the risk of discovery loomed large. Yet, they pressed on, driven by a shared belief in the importance of their mission. Unbeknownst to them, their greatest challenge lay not beneath the ground but within the ranks of their own organization. In October 1953, the quiet hum of routine at the Schwechat operation masked an unseen danger. George Blake, working deep within British intelligence, had passed critical information about Operation Silver to the KGB. Yet the Soviet authorities, determined to shield their prized asset, refrained from acting openly against the tunnel. The operatives in Vienna remained unaware of the ticking clock above their heads. Peter Montagnon had an uneasy sense of foreboding. Anomalies in intercepted communications hinted at shifts in Soviet awareness, though there was no concrete evidence to confirm this. Montagnon's pleas for heightened security measures were met with reassurances. The success of the operation had fostered a sense of invulnerability, a dangerous misstep in the shadowy world of espionage. Meanwhile, Major White remained focused on maintaining the tunnel's integrity. The delicate wiring and sophisticated equipment required constant attention, and any disruption could lead to catastrophic failure. The weight of secrecy hung heavy on his shoulders, yet he pressed on, unaware of the betrayal already in motion. As Operation Silver continued in Vienna, its influence rippled across Europe. In Berlin, the joint Anglo-American Operation Gold progressed steadily, inspired by the Vienna Tunnel's success. The divided city, a flashpoint of Cold War tensions, became the stage for another ambitious effort to pierce the Soviet veil. Peter Lunn traveled to Berlin to advise the operation, sharing lessons learned from the challenges and triumphs of Operation Silver. The Berlin Tunnel, longer and more complex, posed unique difficulties. The engineers worked tirelessly, drawing on the expertise of the Dollis Hill specialists who had honed their craft in Vienna. For Lunn, Berlin represented both a new frontier and a reflection of the stakes at hand. The city's stark division mirrored the ideological battle consuming the world. As he returned to Vienna, Lunn carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, determined to see Operation Silver through to its end. Back in Schwechat, the Tweed shop continued to operate as a convincing front for the monitoring station. Customers wandered in, browsing through bolts of fabric, oblivious to the covert operation beneath their feet. The shop's unassuming clerks, in reality, skilled operatives, maintained the charade with precision. One of these operatives, Margaret Collins, became an indispensable part of the team. A former codebreaker at Bletchley Park, she brought expertise and dedication to the mission. Margaret's keen ear for linguistic nuances allowed her to identify subtle shifts in Soviet communication patterns. Her work added an extra layer of depth to the intelligence gathered, strengthening the operation's impact. Margaret's quiet resolve inspired those around her. In the dimly lit back room of the Tweed shop, she worked tirelessly alongside Montagnon and the team. Together, they pored over transcripts, piecing together fragments of conversations to form a coherent picture of Soviet strategy. By 1954, Operation Silver had amassed an unparalleled trove of intelligence. British operatives gained insight into Soviet troop movements, political strategies, and internal communications. This information, passed to London, shaped the Western policies and strengthened their position in the Cold War. For Peter Montagnon, the work was a delicate balancing act. The intelligence team had to remain cautious, ensuring that their analysis did not reveal the source of their information. Overstepping could tip off the Soviets, jeopardizing the operation. Margaret Collins and her colleagues faced the same pressures. Each intercepted communication brought a mix of triumph and tension. Every word analyzed was another piece of the puzzle, but also another step closer to potential exposure. Their vigilance created a fragile equilibrium, keeping Operation Silver alive in a world where nothing stayed hidden forever. Exercise Reforger, NATO's test of alliance's strength and speed, uniting forces to rehearse rapid deployment against a looming Cold War threat. The cold wind swept across the tarmac of Ramstein Air Base as the first wave of C-130 transport planes roared in from the west. It was January 1969, and there was urgency in the atmosphere. The world had changed since the Second World War, and the Cold War's icy grip held Europe in a state of constant tension. NATO's newest initiative, Exercise Reforger, which is the return of forces to Germany, had begun. This annual event would serve as both a deterrent and a proof of readiness to face the looming threat of the Warsaw Pact. President Lyndon B. Johnson had announced the withdrawal of 2 U.S. divisions from Europe only a year prior. Critics argued it was a concession, a dangerous gamble amidst a fragile balance of power. But Johnson countered with a pledge: the United States would demonstrate its capability to rapidly redeploy its forces to Europe if needed. Reforger would be the cornerstone of this promise. At the heart of this initial exercise was Colonel Richard "Rick" Madden, a logistics mastermind stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. For months, he had worked tirelessly to coordinate the movement of men, machines, and supplies across the Atlantic. Watching the first units disembark at Ramstein, he allowed himself a rare smile. Soldiers hurried to unload jeeps, tanks, and crates marked with the bold black stencil of the U.S. Army. This was not just a military exercise, it was a message to the world. As night fell, the convoy began moving toward its designated staging grounds in southern Germany. Along the winding roads, columns of M60 Patton tanks rumbled through snow-dusted villages. German civilians gathered along the roadside, curious and wary. For them, the sight of foreign troops stirred memories of past conflicts. For the soldiers, it was a test of endurance and trust. These men were not merely preparing for war, they were standing sentinel over a delicate peace. The first morning of Exercise Reforger brought a biting chill and clear skies over Bavaria. Captain Evelyn Sanders, one of the few women embedded within the logistical command, oversaw the distribution of supplies to forward units. Sanders' work was critical. The success of the exercise depended on ensuring that every soldier's needs were met, from fuel for tanks to rations for troops. She moved quickly, her breath clouding in the frigid air, clipboard in hand as she barked orders to a mix of green recruits and seasoned veterans. Across the border in East Germany, Soviet commanders were watching closely. Colonel Sergei Volkov, a rising star in the Warsaw Pact hierarchy, had been tasked with monitoring NATO's movements. From his perch in a dimly lit operations room in Leipzig, Volkov pored over reports from his intelligence teams. To him, Reforger was more than a defensive drill, it was a signal of NATO's intent. In a small village near the deployment zone, Hans Keller, a schoolteacher, stood outside his home, observing the American convoy passing through. Hans had lived through the chaos of World War II and the division of Germany. To him, these foreign soldiers represented both hope and unease. That night, he wrote in his journal, "They come with their machines and their promises. Will they leave us to fend for ourselves, as others have before?" Meanwhile, Colonel Madden convened a briefing with his key officers in a hastily erected command tent. The room smelled of diesel fuel and damp canvas. "This is not just about moving men and equipment," Madden emphasized, his voice steady but firm. "It's about proving that we can respond faster than they can act. Remember, every step we take here is being measured by Moscow." The officers nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and fatigue. The first day had gone smoothly, but they all knew that the days ahead would bring greater challenges. The exercise was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than any of them could have imagined. By the second day, the logistical strain of exercise reforger began to reveal itself. At a supply depot near Stuttgart, a convoy of trucks arrived with critical ammunition and fuel. Sergeant Mark O'Donnell, a veteran of the Korean War, stood watch as his team unloaded crates. A sudden mechanical failure in one of the forklifts delayed the operation, forcing O'Donnell to rally his men to unload by hand. "We don't have the luxury of time," he growled. "Every minute counts." Further south, Private First Class Luis Ramirez was on his first overseas deployment. Assigned to a reconnaissance unit, he spent the morning navigating dense forests along the Rhine. His unit's mission was simple yet vital: ensure the planned routes were clear for the advancing armored columns. Ramirez's hands trembled slightly as he checked his map under the shadow of towering pines. Despite the training, the reality of operating in unfamiliar terrain brought its own set of fears. In the east, Colonel Volkov's intelligence reports grew more detailed. Soviet surveillance planes and ground-based intercepts pieced together NATO's movements. Volkov knew that these exercises tested more than logistics, they tested resolve. As he examined aerial photographs of NATO's convoys, he pondered how quickly such maneuvers could turn from preparation to provocation. Meanwhile, German farmer Gerhard Weber watched from his fields as helicopters thundered overhead. The crops swayed under the force of the rotor wash. Gerhard's family had farmed this land for generations, enduring wars and political upheavals. Now, he found himself an unwilling observer to a new kind of battle, one fought with preparation and perception rather than bullets. That night, he spoke to his wife, Greta. "They're preparing for something big," he said quietly. "I just hope we're not caught in the middle." As the exercise progressed, cooperation among NATO forces became the focal point. British and Canadian troops joined their American counterparts in the Bavarian countryside. Major William Bill Harris of the British Army marveled at the scale of the operation. "Back home, we train on Salisbury Plain," he remarked to a Canadian officer. "This, though, feels like preparing for the real thing." Canadian Captain Sophie Moreau led her unit in a simulated river crossing near the Danube. The operation demanded precise coordination. Engineers constructed temporary bridges under the cover of night, while infantry secured the opposite bank. Moreau's team worked methodically, each soldier aware of the importance of their task. As dawn broke, the sight of armored vehicles rolling across the makeshift bridge drew cheers from her troops. Colonel Madden, observing from a command post, noted the camaraderie forming among the multinational units. "This is what it's all about," he said to Captain Sanders, who had joined him for the inspection. "If we're going to stand against the Warsaw Pact, we need to do it as one." In Leipzig, Colonel Volkov reviewed intercepted radio transmissions. The cooperation between NATO allies concerned him deeply. "Their strength lies in their unity," he muttered to his aide. "If we're to challenge them, we must find a way to exploit their differences." Back in the village, Hans Keller observed British troops sharing tea with American soldiers during a break. The sight gave him a moment of hope. Perhaps, he thought, the unity displayed here could extend beyond the military. But as tanks rolled on and the exercise intensified, the shadow of what could come remained ever present. On the 5th day of exercise Reforger, a dense fog enveloped the Bavarian forests. The mist clung to the trees and obscured visibility, creating a ghostly atmosphere that slowed the movement of NATO forces. Captain Sanders, overseeing a supply line, muttered under her breath as she scanned the murk. "This is a logistical nightmare," she said, directing drivers with fluorescent batons. In the haze, Private Ramirez and his reconnaissance unit stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse. Inside, they discovered faded photographs and rusting artifacts from the Second World War. The discovery was both haunting and a stark reminder of the stakes they faced. "History doesn't stay buried," Ramirez said quietly to his squad mate. "We're walking in its shadow." Meanwhile, Colonel Madden found himself at odds with local authorities in a nearby town. German officials, wary of the military's impact on their roads and infrastructure, demanded reassurances. "We're here to ensure peace, not disrupt your lives," Madden explained patiently, but the tension was palpable. For many Germans, the sight of tanks rumbling through their streets stirred memories they would rather forget. In Leipzig, Colonel Volkov studied the latest intelligence reports with a growing sense of unease. The NATO forces were proving more coordinated than he had anticipated. He sent a missive to his superiors in Moscow, recommending increased surveillance and contingency planning. "If this is their rehearsal," he wrote, "we must be ready for the main event." At the same time, Hans Keller invited a few American soldiers into his home for coffee. As they sipped from mismatched cups, they spoke of families, hopes, and fears. Despite the language barrier, they found common ground in their humanity. For a brief moment, the tensions of the Cold War felt like a distant shadow. But as the soldiers left, the rumble of engines reminded Hans that peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of history. By the 7th day, exercise Reforger reached its most complex stage, coordinated maneuvers between armored divisions and infantry. In a sprawling valley near the town of Würzburg, NATO forces simulated an engagement scenario designed to test their response to a hypothetical Warsaw Pact incursion. The valley, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forest, provided a natural theater for the exercise. Lieutenant James Carter, commanding a platoon of M60 Patton tanks, received orders to advance along a narrow ridge. The task was daunting, the ridge offered little cover, and visibility was still hampered by lingering fog. "Stay sharp, people," Carter said over the radio. "They're throwing everything at us in this drill, and I don't want us to be the weak link." His voice was steady, but he felt the weight of his men's lives in his hands. On the opposing side of the simulation, Canadian Captain Sophie Moreau led her unit in an ambush scenario. Concealed in the trees, her soldiers awaited the signal to fire smoke rounds to mimic artillery. The tension was palpable as they watched Carter's tanks inch forward. "Timing is everything," Moreau whispered, gripping her binoculars. As the exercise played out, Colonel Madden monitored the proceedings from a command post. He noted the strengths and weaknesses of each unit, preparing detailed reports for NATO's leadership. "This is more than a game," he said to Captain Sanders, who was updating logistics data. "We're proving whether this alliance can hold when it's truly tested." The success of the exercise was not without friction. The multinational cooperation, while impressive, revealed underlying cultural and procedural differences. At a joint planning meeting in a makeshift headquarters, tempers flared over conflicting tactics. "We can't have everyone running their own playbook," Major Harris of the British Army insisted. "There needs to be a single chain of command." American Colonel Madden, known for his pragmatism, intervened. "We're not here to argue," he said firmly. "The Warsaw Pact isn't going to wait while we debate protocols. Let's focus on the mission." Meanwhile, in the nearby village of Oberrat, tensions simmered among the locals. Farmers complained about damaged fields, and shopkeepers worried about declining business as military activity intensified. Gerhard Weber, usually a voice of reason, found himself mediating between his neighbors and military liaisons. "If this is what keeps us safe, we must endure it," he said, though his words felt hollow in the face of mounting frustrations. Back in Leipzig, Colonel Volkov's concerns deepened. Intercepted communications revealed NATO's remarkable adaptability. "They're learning faster than we anticipated," he warned his superiors. "If we underestimate them, we do so at our peril." As the second week of exercise Reforger unfolded, the focus shifted to reconnaissance and counterintelligence. With NATO forces pushing deeper into simulated enemy territory, the stakes grew higher. Private Luis Ramirez found himself on a night patrol along the forested outskirts of Bad Kissingen. Armed with only a map, a radio, and his wits, he moved cautiously through the dense underbrush. Every snapped twig and distant rustle set his nerves on edge. "Keep it quiet, Ramirez," whispered Sergeant Taylor, his squad leader. "This isn't training back in Fort Polk. You want to make it home. Stay sharp." Across the imaginary front line, Soviet intelligence officers ramped up their monitoring efforts. Colonel Volkov dispatched specialized teams to test NATO's electronic warfare resilience. They jammed radio frequencies and mimicked enemy communications, forcing NATO units to adapt. The result was chaos within some units, but others, like Ramirez's patrol, managed to maintain discipline. When Ramirez's squad stumbled upon a false signal planted by Volkov's operatives, the young private's quick thinking prevented an ambush. "This isn't right," he said, scrutinizing the coordinates relayed over the radio. Sergeant Taylor nodded. "Good call, Ramirez. Let's regroup and report this." Back at a NATO field base near Nuremberg, soldiers of different nationalities worked side by side, overcoming language barriers and cultural differences. Canadian Captain Sophie Moreau, now collaborating with a British engineering unit, marveled at the ingenuity displayed during a river crossing exercise. "They're building bridges as fast as we can plan routes," she remarked to her second-in-command. Major Harris, ever the skeptic, watched the operation with crossed arms. "Impressive," he admitted grudgingly. "But speed means nothing if the structure can't hold." His doubts were silenced when the first convoy of tanks successfully crossed the makeshift bridge. Elsewhere in the base, Captain Sanders joined a meeting of logistics officers. The room buzzed with activity as representatives from various NATO nations coordinated supply lines. Sanders shared a rare laugh with a Danish officer over a shared challenge, ensuring enough coffee rations for troops. "It's the real fuel for this operation," she quipped. Despite the camaraderie, cracks in the alliance became evident when disagreements over priority routes delayed a critical supply delivery. Colonel Madden, called in to mediate, made his stance clear. "We're here to support each other, not compete," he said sternly. "Every delay weakens us as a whole." The third week of exercise Reforger saw the forces subjected to a simulated crisis. A hypothetical scenario involving a Warsaw Pact breakthrough in the Fulda Gap required NATO forces to respond swiftly and decisively. Under gray skies that threatened rain, Colonel Madden received orders to mobilize his units toward a strategic choke point near Würzburg. Lieutenant James Carter's platoon of M60 Pattons was among the first to receive the call. The narrow roads, slick with early drizzle, became treacherous for the lumbering tanks. "Watch your spacing and keep comms clear," Carter barked over the radio. The rumble of engines echoed through the valley as the convoy snaked its way toward the defensive position. Meanwhile, Captain Sophie Moreau's engineering unit was tasked with securing a key bridge vital to the exercise. Under the cover of darkness, her soldiers worked tirelessly, reinforcing the structure to withstand the weight of heavy vehicles. "We don't know if this bridge will be attacked in the scenario," Moreau said, her voice calm but firm. "But if it is, it will hold." In Leipzig, Colonel Volkov monitored the simulated engagement closely. His teams devised strategies to exploit NATO's responses, pushing the exercise's realism to its limits. "Let's see how they handle unpredictability," he muttered, as he ordered simulated artillery strikes on NATO's advancing units. As the scenario unfolded, the human cost of war, simulated though it was, became apparent. In a mock casualty station set up in a forest clearing, medics scrambled to treat soldiers marked as wounded during the exercise. Private Luis Ramirez volunteered to assist, carrying stretchers and calming anxious comrades. "This is just practice," one soldier groaned, clutching his arm where a medic had painted a mock wound. Ramirez nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "But it's practice for what we all hope never happens." Elsewhere, tensions flared between German civilians and NATO forces. In Oberrat, farmer Gerhard Weber confronted a convoy that had inadvertently damaged a section of his fields. "Do you think these crops grow back overnight?" he shouted at a weary supply sergeant. The situation was diffused when Captain Sanders arrived, offering Weber a sincere apology and promising compensation. That evening, Sanders reflected on the incident with Colonel Madden. "They didn't ask for this exercise to be in their backyard," she said. "We need to remember that these are their homes, not just our training grounds." Madden nodded solemnly. The Cold War touches everyone in ways we often forget. The culmination of the exercise brought NATO forces together for a final combined assault simulation. Armored columns from the US, UK, and Canada advanced in unison, supported by aerial reconnaissance and artillery. The sight of multinational forces working seamlessly drew cheers from onlookers, including German civilians who had gathered on a nearby hill to watch. Major Harris, watching from a command vehicle, turned to Captain Moreau. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his skepticism melting into admiration. "It seems we might actually know what we're doing." For Colonel Volkov, the success of NATO's final maneuver was both impressive and alarming. "Their coordination is formidable," he admitted to his aide. "But they are still vulnerable. Unity is their greatest strength and their Achilles heel. We must remember that." As the exercise concluded, Hans Keller stood outside his home, watching the departing convoys. He waved to a passing American soldier, who returned the gesture with a smile. Perhaps, Keller thought, there's hope that these drills mean peace, not war. As the NATO forces began their post-exercise evaluations, the sound of engines still lingered in the air. The simulated battles may have concluded, but for many, the lessons learned would resonate far beyond the Bavarian hills. Colonel Madden stood on a rise overlooking the makeshift field headquarters, reflecting on the complexities of modern warfare. The true challenge, he mused aloud to Captain Sanders, isn't just mastering logistics or tactics. It's ensuring that when the time comes, this alliance can act as one. Captain Sanders nodded. Every country has its priorities. It's a miracle we've managed to pull this off without more friction. She glanced at the multinational flags fluttering above the camp. But if we can come together here, there's hope we can do it when it really matters. In Leipzig, Colonel Volkov prepared his final report for Moscow. The NATO exercise had revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Their ability to adapt is commendable, he wrote. However, their dependence on joint decision-making could be exploited in a real conflict. Unity takes time, and time is a luxury in war. Meanwhile, in Oberrat, Hans Keller helped repair the damage to his fields, assisted by a group of off-duty soldiers. Among them was Private Ramirez, who had volunteered to lend a hand. "You're not so bad for a soldier," Hans joked, handing Ramirez a bucket of tools. Ramirez grinned. "And you're not so bad for a farmer." The two men worked in companionable silence, a small reminder that even amidst the specter of war, humanity endured. As the final debriefings unfolded, the fog that had hampered operations earlier in the exercise became a metaphor for the uncertainties of conflict. NATO commanders emphasized the need for better communication protocols and faster response times to unexpected challenges. Major Harris, ever the realist, spoke candidly during the British Army's review. "We performed admirably, but let's not kid ourselves. If this had been real, those delays could have cost lives." His words were met with nods of agreement and murmurs of determination. Across the Atlantic, analysts in Washington and Ottawa reviewed footage and reports from the exercise. Colonel Madden's leadership and Captain Moreau's ingenuity were singled out as examples of what NATO could achieve when unity prevailed. "These exercises aren't just about military readiness," one Pentagon official remarked. "They're about showing the world that our alliance stands firm." For the soldiers on the ground, the debriefings offered a moment of reflection. Private Ramirez, now a little more confident in his role, sat with his squad mates under the stars. "You think we'll ever see the real thing?" one of them asked. Ramirez shrugged. "I hope not. But if we do, at least we know we've got each other." Operation Condor, a covert network of South American dictatorships collaborating to suppress rebellion, marked by political repression, disappearances, and Cold War intrigue. The 1970s were a time of shadows and whispers in South America. Across the continent, the specter of communism loomed large, fueling fear among right-wing regimes and their powerful allies. In somber offices and behind closed doors, alliances were forged, not of hope or prosperity, but of repression and terror. This was the birth of Operation Condor, a covert network that transcended borders, enlisting dictatorships in a grim pact to hunt down and silence political dissent. The operation was a labyrinth of intrigue and power, connecting the military juntas of Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Though shrouded in secrecy, its effects rippled across the globe. Disappearances, assassinations, and torture became tools of statecraft, leaving families broken and voices extinguished. Yet, amid the chilling efficiency of Condor's machinery, there were moments of defiance and survival. It is within these intersecting stories, of victims, oppressors, and unlikely heroes, that the full picture of Operation Condor emerges. This is not just a story of political maneuvers or military strategies, it is a chronicle of humanity under siege, of lives converging and unraveling in the shadows of a war waged without borders. In the early 1970s, Santiago de Chile vibrated with the energy of change. The streets buzzed with voices chanting for reforms under President Salvador Allende, whose socialist government aimed to rewrite the rules of society. For many, it was a time of hope, but for others, it was a sign of chaos brewing. To the generals and oligarchs, Allende's policies were an existential threat. To their allies abroad, particularly the United States, he represented a dangerous foothold for communism in the Western Hemisphere. The coup came swiftly. On September 11, 1973, the roar of jets filled the air as the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, laid siege to the presidential palace. The president's final speech crackled over the radio, a defiant call for resistance even as bombs tore through the heart of Santiago. By evening, Allende was dead, and a new era of dictatorship had begun. Across Chile, thousands were detained, many never returned. The coup was a signal to other regimes in the region. In Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Asunción, military leaders watched closely, recognizing a blueprint for dealing with dissent. In Washington, strategists nodded in approval, confident that stability, on their terms, could be secured. It was not long before clandestine meetings began. High-ranking officers from across South America gathered in secret, their discussions centered on a singular goal: eliminating subversion. But subversion was a broad term easily twisted. It encompassed guerrilla fighters and human rights activists, union leaders, and priests. Anyone who questioned the regime or sought to organize the oppressed became a target. The seeds of fear had been sown, and Operation Condor was poised to take root. In a nondescript office in Buenos Aires, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the quiet hum of clandestine conversations. It was 1975, and the military leaders from across South America had convened for a series of covert meetings. Representatives from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia sat at the table, their expressions guarded but resolute. The unifying purpose was clear: a collaborative operation to track, detain, and eliminate political opponents, no matter where they fled. These generals shared a vision: borders would not impede their pursuit of enemies. Intelligence agencies would exchange information freely, operatives could move seamlessly between nations, and dissidents would have nowhere to hide. They named their creation Operation Condor, a nod to the scavenging bird of prey that patrolled the Andean skies, a predator with unrelenting focus. While the agreement promised to streamline counterinsurgency efforts, it also concealed darker motives. The operation's mandate extended far beyond guerrilla fighters. Anyone suspected of opposing the regimes, writers, students, clergy, and even foreign nationals, could be swept into its vortex. The American Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, provided resources and technical support, viewing Condor as a bulwark against communism during the Cold War. For many, the operation began with a knock at the door in the dead of night. Trucks would arrive, shadowed by soldiers in plain clothes. Families were torn from their sleep as loved ones were dragged into unmarked vehicles, disappearing without a trace. In the years to come, the Condor network would become synonymous with terror, its victims numbering in the tens of thousands. In the summer of 1976, Ana Maria Rodriguez, a young school teacher in Buenos Aires, waved goodbye to her husband, Esteban, as he left for work. He never came home. At first, Ana thought there had been an accident, but as days turned into weeks, whispers among neighbors confirmed her fears. Esteban was one of Los Desaparecidos, the disappeared. Ana was relentless in her search. She visited police stations, hospitals, and even the Ministry of the Interior, where cold-eyed officials dismissed her inquiries. Each door she knocked on revealed another wall of silence. Perhaps he fled, they would say. Perhaps he had something to hide. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Esteban was likely being held in one of the regime's clandestine detention centers. In Montevideo, across the Rio de la Plata, 23-year-old Jamie Pereira, union organizer, faced a similar fate. Detained during a routine meeting, Jamie was transferred under the cover of night to a secret facility. His captors were not just Uruguayan soldiers but a mix of operatives from Chile and Argentina, working together under Operation Condor. Jamie's interrogators sought names, networks, and plans, using methods that left scars both physical and mental. These stories were far from isolated. The disappeared became a haunting reality across South America, with families clutching photographs and staging silent marches in public squares. Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires began their vigils, wearing white headscarves and demanding answers. Their courage stood in stark contrast to the pervasive fear, but the Condor network ensured that resistance carried steep risks. On the crisp morning of September 21, 1976, Orlando Letelier, a former Chilean diplomat under President Allende, prepared for his day in Washington, D.C. Letelier had become a vocal critic of Pinochet's regime after fleeing Chile in the aftermath of the 1973 coup. His speeches and writings called attention to the human rights abuses in his homeland, making him a symbol of resistance against authoritarianism. As Letelier drove through the bustling streets with his colleagues, a bomb detonated beneath his car. The explosion shattered the tranquility of Sheridan Circle, leaving smoke and chaos in its wake. Letelier and his assistant, Ronnie Moffat, were killed instantly, while her husband, Michael, survived with injuries. It was an audacious act of political violence, carried out on foreign soil, and it sent shockwaves across the world. The assassination bore the hallmarks of Operation Condor. Declassified documents later revealed that Chile's intelligence agency, the DINA, had orchestrated the attack with the assistance of American expatriate Michael Townley, a former CIA operative. The murder of Letelier demonstrated the far-reaching power of Condor, capable of silencing dissent even in the heart of the United States. The international outrage was swift. Human rights organizations, journalists, and political figures condemned the attack. However, amidst the Cold War's complex geopolitics, justice for Letelier's murder would take decades. The brazenness of the assassination highlighted Condor's willingness to cross borders and ignore sovereignty, exposing the fragility of safety even for those in exile. In Paraguay's capital, Asunción, a nondescript archive sat unnoticed by the public. Within its walls lay the Archives of Terror, a meticulous record of Operation Condor's activities. These documents detailed the names of dissidents, the collaboration between South American governments, and the operations conducted against perceived enemies of the state. Among the records was evidence of Paraguay's dictator, Alfredo Stroessner, actively facilitating Condor's reach. The archives also revealed chilling details about the Condor system. Flights between countries were used to transport detainees to clandestine prisons, where they faced torture and execution. Intelligence agencies shared information through secure channels, while death squads executed operations with ruthless precision. The files showed that the United States provided technical support and training, deepening its controversial role in the operation. One of the most notorious elements of Condor was the death flights. Detainees were drugged, loaded onto military aircraft, and dropped into the ocean. This method erased evidence, leaving families to grapple with uncertainty and grief. For those involved in these operations, it was a task cloaked in the justification of national security, yet the human cost was incalculable. The discovery of the archives decades later would provide a foundation for justice. Survivors, families of victims, and human rights advocates used the documents to build cases against the perpetrators. But in the 1970s, the network remained a shadowy enigma, its scope and ruthlessness hidden from public view. At the edge of Santiago, hidden behind tall walls, stood Villa Grimaldi. Once a grand estate, it had been repurposed by Pinochet's secret police into a detention and torture center. Its outward appearance betrayed no hint of the horrors within, but for those who entered, it became a place of no return. Maria Gonzalez, a university student, was taken to Villa Grimaldi in the early hours of a June morning in 1977. Blindfolded and shackled, she was dragged into a damp cell. The echoes of distant screams were her first introduction to the grim reality of the facility. Interrogators demanded names and affiliations, accusing her of connections to leftist groups. Maria's refusal to cooperate brought waves of pain, inflicted with clinical precision by her captors. The facility operated with chilling efficiency. Cells known as casitas, or little houses, were barely large enough to sit in. Prisoners were electrocuted, beaten, and psychologically tormented. The guards moved with an air of detachment, carrying out their orders with mechanical obedience. For Maria, the days blurred into weeks, her spirit tested in ways she could never have imagined. Yet, even in the darkest corners of Villa Grimaldi, defiance flickered. Prisoners whispered to one another when guards were absent, sharing stories of resistance and hope. Some etched messages into the walls, silent cries for a future that might never come. Maria survived her ordeal, emerging as a witness to the atrocities. Her testimony, years later, would help bring global attention to the crimes committed at Villa Grimaldi, a symbol of Operation Condor's brutality. In Montevideo, the tension was palpable in 1976. Uruguayan activists, journalists, and union members knew they were under constant surveillance. Among them were Liliana and Daniel, a married couple who had worked tirelessly to organize labor strikes and distribute underground literature. Their actions had made them targets of the regime. Late one evening, armed men stormed their apartment. Liliana and Daniel were separated, blindfolded, and transported to different locations. Unbeknownst to them, their fate had already been sealed under the directives of Operation Condor. Liliana was sent to a clandestine prison in Argentina, while Daniel was flown to a detention center in Brazil. The coordination was seamless, a testament to the Condor network's reach. Operatives shared intelligence on dissidents across borders, ensuring that no one could escape its grasp. For months, the couple endured interrogations, each desperate for news of the other. Liliana clung to hope, her thoughts often drifting to the last moment she had seen Daniel's face. In a twist of fate, Liliana was freed through the intervention of an international human rights organization. She later discovered Daniel's tragic fate. He had been executed in Brazil, his body disposed of in a remote jungle. Liliana's testimony became a powerful tool for exposing the network's cross-border kidnappings, giving voice to countless victims whose stories had been silenced. Far from South America, in Paris, a shadow of Condor's reach emerged. The French government, embroiled in its own colonial past, had provided training in counterinsurgency techniques to South American regimes. These methods, honed during France's brutal war in Algeria, became part of Condor's blueprint for suppressing dissent. French activists began to uncover these connections, documenting the flow of expertise and tactics. Pierre Dubois, a journalist, compiled reports that linked France's influence to the practices of torture and surveillance employed in South America. His work faced resistance from within, as officials sought to suppress the embarrassing revelations. The collaboration raised uncomfortable questions. Could democratic nations justify enabling authoritarian regimes in the name of ideological battles? The French connection underscored the global dimensions of Operation Condor, showing how Cold War geopolitics blurred the lines between ally and accomplice. In the corridors of Langley, Virginia, the Central Intelligence Agency monitored South America with unwavering focus. To the CIA, Operation Condor was more than an alliance of dictatorships, it was a firewall against communism in the Western Hemisphere. Classified documents later revealed how deeply the agency was involved, offering technical expertise, communication equipment, and training to the operations architects. One of the most significant connections was through Michael Townley, a former CIA operative who worked closely with the Chilean DINA. Townley's involvement in the assassination of Orlando Letelier demonstrated the CIA's willingness to align with oppressive regimes to maintain its strategic interests. The agency's resources enabled Condor to expand its reach, facilitating surveillance networks and coordinating cross-border operations. For many within the CIA, Condor's methods were a necessary evil. Yet, the moral implications of supporting regimes known for torture and disappearances were undeniable. Some operatives voiced concerns internally, but the agency's leadership remained resolute. Stability in South America, no matter the cost, was deemed essential in the global fight against the Soviet Union. Decades later, the release of declassified files shed light on these collaborations. Survivors and families of victims demanded accountability, questioning the ethics of Cold War strategies that prioritized ideology over human rights. The CIA's shadow loomed large over Condor, a reminder of how global politics could fuel local atrocities. In the heart of Buenos Aires, the Plaza de Mayo became a place of quiet defiance. Each Thursday, a group of women gathered, wearing white headscarves embroidered with the names of their missing children. These were the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, united by grief and a determination to uncover the truth. Among them was Rosa Alvarez, whose son, Javier, had disappeared after a student protest. For months, Rosa knocked on doors and filed petitions, only to be met with indifference or threats. When she joined the mothers at the plaza, she found solace in their shared pain and strength in their collective voice. The women walked in silence, holding photographs of their loved ones. Their presence was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the dictatorship. The regime dismissed them as mad women, but their courage drew international attention to the horrors of Operation Condor. Over time, the group expanded, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance. Rosa's story, like many others, became part of a larger narrative of resilience. The mother's quiet marches forced the world to confront the human cost of Condor's operations, ensuring that the disappeared would not be forgotten. In the skies above the Atlantic Ocean, silence enveloped the military aircraft. Inside, bound and drugged detainees lay motionless, their fates sealed. These were the infamous death flights, one of the most chilling methods employed under Operation Condor. Prisoners were thrown from planes at high altitudes, their bodies swallowed by the sea. Captain Miguel Fuentes, a young Argentine pilot, was tasked with one such flight. Trained to follow orders without question, he carried out the mission with an uneasy heart. The faces of the detainees, some barely older than his younger sister, haunted him. As the aircraft reached its designated altitude, the soldiers opened the hatch. One by one, the prisoners were pushed into the void. The death flights symbolized the calculated brutality of Condor. They erased evidence and instilled terror, leaving families with no closure. For Captain Fuentes, the weight of his actions became unbearable. Years later, he would testify in court, his account offering a rare glimpse into the inner workings of these operations. The death flights were a stark reminder of how Condor's efficiency relied on dehumanization. Victims were stripped of identity and treated as threats to be eliminated, their humanity erased in the name of ideology. In 1979, a discovery in Paraguay shook the foundations of secrecy surrounding Operation Condor. A local judge, Agustin Guaburu, authorized a search of a police station in the town of Lambert. Inside, officers uncovered the Archives of Terror, a trove of documents detailing the atrocities committed by the regime of Alfredo Stroessner and its Condor allies. The files contained names, dates, and chilling descriptions of coordinated operations. They exposed the systematic exchange of intelligence between South American dictatorships and the participation of foreign agencies in facilitating surveillance and disappearances. For years, the families of the disappeared had fought against denial and silence. The archives offered irrefutable evidence of the horrors they had endured. Among the documents was information about the fate of individuals like Liliana Pereira, whose story had resonated across Uruguay and Argentina. Her abduction, interrogation, and eventual release were detailed alongside the tragic accounts of others who had not survived. These revelations added weight to the calls for accountability and justice. The international response was swift. Human rights organizations and journalists used the archives to piece together the broader picture of Condor's operations. The findings were presented to the United Nations, spurring investigations and prompting governments to reconsider their complicity. For the survivors, the archives became a symbol of hope, proof that even the most carefully guarded secrets could come to light. Not all who served in the regimes aligned with Operation Condor did so willingly. Among the ranks of soldiers, police officers, and bureaucrats were individuals who struggled with the moral implications of their roles. Some chose to resist, risking everything to undermine the machinery of repression from within. Hugo Alvarez, a clerk in the Chilean DINA, found himself privy to the inner workings of the intelligence network. Tasked with cataloging detainee records, he was haunted by the faces he saw in photographs and the accounts of torture he overheard. Unable to remain silent, Hugo began smuggling documents to human rights groups operating in exile. Each transfer was fraught with danger. If discovered, Hugo would face imprisonment or execution. Yet his efforts saved lives. Warnings delivered through underground networks allowed some dissidents to escape before they could be apprehended. Hugo's actions, though small in the grand scope of Condor, demonstrated that even in an atmosphere of fear, conscience could prevail. Hugo's story was not unique. Others, including military officers and civil servants, found ways to resist. Their courage, often overlooked in the larger narrative of Operation Condor, served as a testament to the enduring strength of humanity in the face of oppression. By the early 1980s, the tides began to turn. Economic instability, mounting international pressure, and growing domestic resistance weakened the grip of South America's military regimes. Argentina's defeat in the Falklands War of 1982 further eroded the junta's authority, emboldening the population to demand change. In Uruguay, Brazil, and Chile, protests swelled, fueled by the testimonies of survivors and the persistence of human rights organizations. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, once dismissed as inconsequential, became icons of resistance. Their marches, combined with international attention, forced governments to confront their pasts. Operation Condor, once a powerful network of repression, began to unravel. With the fall of authoritarian regimes, survivors and families of victims pushed for truth and justice. Courts reopened cases long thought buried, and efforts to locate the remains of the disappeared gained momentum. The fall of the juntas marked the beginning of a new chapter for South America, one defined by the struggle to reconcile with a dark past. Yet, for many, the scars of Condor remain, a reminder of the fragility of freedom and the resilience of those who fought to preserve it. In the early 1990s, as democracy returned to South America, the push for accountability gained momentum. Survivors, families of the disappeared, and human rights organizations demanded answers. They wanted trials for the architects of Operation Condor, the unmasking of collaborators, and the recovery of the thousands who had vanished. Argentina led the way with the trial of the juntas in 1985, one of the first major efforts to prosecute military leaders. Among those in the courtroom were relatives of the disappeared, clutching photographs and demanding justice. The testimonies were harrowing, detailing torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The trial resulted in convictions for key figures, including General Jorge Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera, though later political compromises would soften their sentences. In Chile, the shadow of Augusto Pinochet loomed large. Although he stepped down as president in 1990, Pinochet retained power as commander-in-chief of the military and was granted immunity under the country's constitution. His arrest in London in 1998, at the request of a Spanish judge, marked a turning point. The event underscored the principle of universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity and inspired similar cases in other nations. Meanwhile, in Paraguay, the discovery of the Archives of Terror provided crucial evidence for legal proceedings. Families of victims used the records to identify perpetrators and demand reparations. Slowly, the veil of impunity began to lift, but the process was long and fraught with obstacles. The pursuit of justice was not just about punishment, it was about uncovering the truth, honoring the memory of those lost, and ensuring that such atrocities could never happen again. Even as trials began, the wounds left by Operation Condor remained deep. Entire generations in South America grew up with the weight of what had been lost: parents, siblings, friends, and neighbors taken away in the dead of night. Communities were fractured, trust eroded by years of surveillance and betrayal. In Buenos Aires, Rosario Fernandez, the daughter of a disappeared union leader, dedicated her life to documenting stories of the Condor victims. She interviewed survivors, piecing together fragmented memories into a coherent narrative. For Rosario, this was both a personal journey and a way to confront a history many preferred to forget. Across the continent, memorials sprang up. In Santiago, the site of Villa Grimaldi became a peace park, a stark reminder of the atrocities committed there. In Buenos Aires, the ESMA, once a naval academy turned detention center, was transformed into a museum of memory. These spaces served as places for reflection and education, ensuring future generations would understand the cost of authoritarianism. The legacy of Operation Condor extended beyond South America. Its revelations influenced international human rights law, reinforcing the importance of accountability and the rights of victims. The network's methods and consequences became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. In Rome, 1999, an Italian court opened a case against several former South American military officials for the murder of Italian citizens under Operation Condor. Among the accused were high-ranking officers from Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. Italy, like Spain, invoked universal jurisdiction, asserting its right to prosecute crimes committed beyond its borders. Maria Bertolucci, whose brother had disappeared in Buenos Aires during the military dictatorship, sat in the courtroom, clutching a faded photograph. Her testimony was part of a larger effort to hold perpetrators accountable. The trial revealed how Condor's reach extended to Europe, targeting exiles and dissidents who believed they were safe on foreign soil. These cases underscored the international dimensions of Condor. Intelligence sharing agreements between South American regimes and foreign governments had facilitated operations far beyond the continent. The legal proceedings in Italy and Spain highlighted the global responsibility to address crimes against humanity, reinforcing the principle that no regime could operate in absolute impunity. By the early 2000s, the trials of Operation Condor's architects became a symbol of the international commitment to justice. Courts in Europe, South America, and even the United States took on cases linked to the network's atrocities, reflecting a growing recognition of crimes against humanity. In Spain, Judge Baltasar Garzón emerged as a leading figure in the pursuit of justice. His efforts to arrest Augusto Pinochet in 1998 set a precedent for holding former dictators accountable on foreign soil. Garzón also investigated Condor's operations, uncovering evidence that implicated high-ranking officials in the disappearances of Spanish nationals in South America. His work highlighted the interconnectedness of Condor's victims and the global responsibility to seek justice. In Washington, D.C., declassified documents revealed the extent of the U.S. government's knowledge of and involvement in Operation Condor. The files included memos detailing support for anti-communist efforts in South America and communications between American officials and South American dictators. These revelations spurred debates about accountability and the moral costs of Cold War policies. The international trials were more than legal proceedings, they were acts of remembrance and defiance. Survivors and families testified about the horrors they endured, refusing to let the past fade into obscurity. For many, the trials offered a measure of closure, a recognition of their pain and the crimes committed against their loved ones. Not all resistance to Operation Condor came from the victims. Some individuals within the oppressive regimes risked their lives to undermine the system from within. These acts of defiance, though small in scale, had profound impacts. In Brazil, Captain Marcelo Ribeiro, an intelligence officer, secretly leaked information about Condor's operations to human rights activists. Marcelo had grown disillusioned with the regime's brutality, especially after witnessing the torture of a detainee who was barely out of his teens. His leaks helped expose secret prisons and saved lives, but they came at a cost. Marcelo was discovered and imprisoned, spending years in solitary confinement before his eventual release. Similarly, in Uruguay, journalist Ana Suarez smuggled evidence of disappearances to international media outlets. Her reporting broke through the regime's censorship, sparking outrage abroad and drawing attention to Condor's atrocities. Ana lived in constant fear of retaliation but continued her work, knowing the risk was worth the truth. These acts of resistance were a reminder that even within systems of repression, there were those who chose courage over compliance. Their sacrifices ensured that the world would eventually learn the truth about Operation Condor. In Argentina, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo fought not only for justice for their missing children but also for the recovery of their stolen grandchildren. During the dictatorship, pregnant women in detention centers were often kept alive until they gave birth, after which their infants were taken and placed with families loyal to the regime. By the 2000s, DNA technology became a powerful tool in the search for these stolen children. The grandmothers worked tirelessly, compiling genetic databases and urging young adults to come forward if they suspected their origins. Many discovered they were the children of desaparecidos, their entire identities built on lies. Among them was Tomás Silva, a university student who had always felt disconnected from his adoptive parents. A DNA test confirmed that he was the son of two activists who had been killed shortly after his birth. The revelation was both liberating and devastating, forcing Tomás to reconcile with a past he had never known. The recovery of stolen children was one of the most poignant chapters in the aftermath of Operation Condor. It highlighted the enduring impact of the network's atrocities, while offering a chance for healing and reconciliation for families torn apart by the regime's cruelty. Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. In the heart of Europe, a quiet tension was all over Czechoslovakia as the summer of 1968 began. The Cold War had cast its long, oppressive shadow over the continent for decades. At this time, the world had grown accustomed to the standoff between East and West, with every nation carefully aligning itself under the watchful eyes of superpowers. Czechoslovakia, a member of the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact, had spent years under a rigid communist regime. But beneath the surface, a change was brewing. The people of Czechoslovakia yearned for freedom. Political and cultural restrictions had stifled them for too long, and they couldn't bear it any longer. In Prague, intellectuals gathered in secret meetings, discussing reforms that could bring life to a system suffocating under its own weight. On the streets, whispers of hope spread among citizens, each daring to imagine a life less controlled. The Soviet Union, however, watched with unease as the seeds of reform were planted. The world turned its gaze toward Prague as Alexander Dubček rose to power. Appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in January 1968, Dubček promised socialism with a human face. He aimed to loosen the grip of authoritarian rule, granting freedoms of speech and press and limiting the influence of Soviet-style governance. His vision ignited a fire in the hearts of Czechoslovakians, but it also stoked the fears of Moscow. Dubček's reforms were bold, daring to challenge the very foundations of Soviet control. Far from Prague, in the Kremlin, Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev and his advisors debated. The leadership of the Warsaw Pact nations viewed Czechoslovakia's reforms as a threat. If one nation slipped out of their grasp, what would stop others from following? Behind closed doors, plans were laid, and armies were prepared. The silence before the storm grew deafening as the summer days stretched on. Czechoslovakia stood on the edge of a precipice, unaware that its quest for freedom would soon provoke a response that would shake the entire Eastern Bloc. Prague, the beating heart of Czechoslovakia, pulsed with newfound energy in the spring of 1968. The streets were alive with vibrant debates, art exhibitions, and political rallies. Citizens began to openly question the status quo, emboldened by Alexander Dubček's reforms. For the first time in decades, the press was free to critique the government, and intellectuals published works that challenged communist orthodoxy. A sense of hope swept through the nation like a warm breeze after a harsh winter. In the countryside, farmers spoke of their dreams for a more independent economy, while students in universities demanded a say in their future. Factories hummed with whispers of worker councils, and the once monolithic Communist Party found itself adapting to a reality it could no longer fully control. The reformist movement, known as the Prague Spring, was blossoming, and Dubček became its unlikely gardener. Yet, not everyone welcomed these changes. Czechoslovakia's hardliners viewed the reforms as dangerous, a potential unraveling of everything the party had built. They quietly reported to Moscow, painting a picture of a nation on the brink of rebellion. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev and his advisors pored over intelligence reports. The reforms were not just a threat to Soviet authority, they were a potential spark that could ignite other Eastern Bloc nations. As the weeks passed, Dubček and his allies faced growing pressure from within and beyond. Even as they tried to balance the hopes of their people with the expectations of their Warsaw Pact allies, the tension became unbearable. To the reformers, the winds of change felt liberating. But to the Soviets, they were a gathering storm. In Moscow, Brezhnev convened a high-stakes meeting in a dimly lit chamber of the Kremlin. Around the long, polished table sat representatives from East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, all allies under the Warsaw Pact. The question before them was simple yet loaded with consequence: how should they respond to the events unfolding in Czechoslovakia? For some, like Poland's the Ladislaw Gomulka and East Germany's Walter Ulbricht, the answer was clear. Dubček's reforms were a cancer that needed to be excised before they spread. If we allow Prague to defy us, Ulbricht warned, it will only embolden dissent in our own countries. Others, like Hungary's János Kadar, urged caution. Military intervention, he argued, could backfire and deepen the cracks already forming in the Soviet-led alliance. Brezhnev listened, his expression unreadable. To him, the stakes were personal as well as political. The Soviet Union had sacrificed millions of lives to establish its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe after World War II. To let one nation stray was to betray that legacy. But an invasion would be no small feat. It would mean risking international condemnation and straining the fragile balance of power in the Cold War. As the meeting dragged on, Brezhnev made his decision. The Warsaw Pact could not afford to lose Czechoslovakia. Plans for a military intervention were quietly set in motion. For now, Brezhnev would continue diplomatic talks with Dubček, but the clock was ticking. In the streets of Prague, life continued as usual, unaware of the storm brewing to the east. As the summer sun illuminated the cobblestone streets of Prague, a growing unease began to settle over the city. The vibrant optimism of the Prague spring was tempered by ominous warnings. Reports trickled in of Soviet troop movements near the borders, and whispers of impending intervention spread through political circles. Despite this, Alexander Dubček and his reformist government pressed on, determined to carve out a unique path for Czechoslovakia within the communist framework. In the cafes and parks of Prague, debates grew heated. Some citizens believed that Dubček's reforms could hold off Soviet aggression by proving that socialism could coexist with personal freedoms. Others were less optimistic, pointing to Hungary's bloody uprising in 1956 as a reminder of what could happen when the Soviet Union felt its authority threatened. Still, hope persisted, fueled by the sight of newspapers freely reporting the truth and artists creating works without fear of censorship. Within the government, a storm of its own brewed. Hardline communists in Czechoslovakia, loyal to Moscow, worked in the shadows to undermine Dubček's efforts. Secretly, they sent letters to Soviet officials, pleading for intervention to restore order. Dubček, ever the optimist, believed that dialogue with the Soviets could prevent a crisis. He traveled to Moscow multiple times, each meeting ending with vague promises and subtle threats. Meanwhile, in rural Czechoslovakia, life seemed unchanged. Farmers harvested their crops, and factory workers continued their routines. But even in the countryside, the air of unease was palpable. Radios crackled with news of Soviet concerns over counter-revolutionary activities in Prague. Soldiers stationed in border regions whispered among themselves, wondering if they would soon face the unthinkable, a confrontation with the Red Army. August arrived with an oppressive heat that mirrored the escalating tensions. On Czechoslovakia's borders, the movements of Warsaw-packed troops could no longer be ignored. The official explanation was that the maneuvers were part of joint military exercises, but few believed it. Soviet tanks rumbled through the narrow roads of Poland, and East German forces drilled relentlessly. The war machine was assembling, and its target was clear. Inside the Kremlin, the decision to invade had been made. Brezhnev and his advisors finalized plans for Operation Danube, a coordinated effort involving hundreds of thousands of troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The objective was to crush the reformist movement in Czechoslovakia and reinstall a government more loyal to Moscow. As the pieces fell into place, the Soviets took measures to ensure that their plans would remain secret until the very last moment. In Prague, Dubček remained steadfast. At a meeting of the Central Committee, he urged his colleagues to remain calm and united. "We must not give them a pretext," he implored. His faith in diplomacy persisted, even as his closest allies grew increasingly skeptical. Privately, some members of his government began preparing for the worst, knowing that a Soviet invasion would leave their country defenseless. By mid-August, the tension reached a breaking point. Citizens in Prague took to the streets, waving Czechoslovak flags and chanting slogans of unity. Student leaders organized protests, calling for solidarity in the face of foreign threats. The spirit of the Prague Spring burned brightly, but it cast a long shadow. Far to the east, Soviet generals gave their final orders. The invasion would begin in just a matter of days. On the night of August 20th, 1968, darkness fell over Prague, unaware of the catastrophe that was only hours away. Families sat in their homes, listening to radios that carried hopeful news of ongoing diplomatic efforts. The streets, still bustling earlier in the day, grew quiet as the city settled into its nightly rhythm. But on the borders of Czechoslovakia, an unprecedented invasion force was ready to strike. Hundreds of thousands of troops from the Soviet Union and its Warsaw-pact allies waited in tense silence. Convoys of tanks and armored vehicles stretched for miles, their engines rumbling faintly in the still night air. The soldiers were young, many barely out of training, and most had been told they were entering Czechoslovakia to protect socialism from counter-revolutionaries. Few understood the true nature of their mission. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev received confirmation: the invasion was underway. Operation Danube had begun. The airwaves in Czechoslovakia would soon be jammed, cutting off communication with the outside world. The world's attention would be turned toward this small country, whose only crime was daring to hope for freedom. For the Soviets, this was not merely a military operation, it was a statement that dissent would not be tolerated within the Eastern Bloc. As midnight approached, Czechoslovak officials scrambled to respond to unconfirmed reports of troop movements. In his office, Alexander Dubček reviewed a communiqué from the Soviet government that warned of severe consequences if counter-revolutionary activities continued. He placed the paper down, his face pale and drawn. Around him, his closest advisors debated whether to call for resistance or urge calm. Dubček knew that neither option could truly prepare his people for what was coming. Shortly after midnight, the first Soviet paratroopers landed at Ruzin International Airport in Prague. Their mission was swift and calculated: secure the airport to allow the rapid deployment of reinforcements. By dawn, Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Czechoslovakia's major cities, their steel treads crushing the hopes of a peaceful resolution. The invasion was overwhelming in scale. Over 200,000 troops and 2,000 tanks poured into the country from every direction. Citizens woke to the roar of engines and the sight of armored vehicles bearing red stars. Confusion and disbelief spread as news of the invasion broke. In Prague, students and workers rushed into the streets, some waving Czechoslovak flags in defiance, others gathering around radios to listen to the government's response. The resistance was immediate but unarmed. Protesters formed human chains, trying to block the tanks, while others painted slogans of freedom on walls. Dubček and his government were caught off guard. From the safety of an underground bunker, he broadcast a desperate plea for calm. "We must resist peacefully," he urged, his voice trembling. "Violence will only bring more suffering." Across the country, local officials echoed his call, though their words often fell on deaf ears. In the chaos, people acted on instinct, some choosing to resist, others to flee or hide. The Soviet soldiers, too, found themselves unprepared. They had been told they would be welcomed as liberators, but the reality was starkly different. Instead of cheers, they were met with jeers, protests, and the unrelenting courage of a population that refused to be silenced. For every protester dragged away or shot at, another took their place. The spirit of the Prague Spring had not yet been extinguished. As dawn broke over Prague, the streets became a stage for defiance. Citizens gathered in the thousands, confronting the seemingly endless lines of Soviet tanks. The morning air was filled with the sound of chants, the fluttering of Czechoslovak flags, and the occasional sharp crack of gunfire. Despite the overwhelming military presence, the people stood firm, determined to defend the fragile freedoms they had briefly tasted. Young students formed makeshift barricades from overturned trams and debris, attempting to slow the advancing forces. In Wenceslas Square, crowds held impromptu rallies, shouting slogans of resistance and singing patriotic songs. The air was charged with both fear and determination. Many held signs written hastily overnight, declaring, "This is our land," and "We are not counter-revolutionaries." The sheer courage of the unarmed protesters astonished even the soldiers sent to suppress them. Soviet commanders were taken aback by the scale and intensity of the resistance. Their mission had been to restore order quickly and decisively, but the spirit of the Prague Spring was not so easily subdued. Some soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to respond to civilians blocking their paths. A few, moved by the bravery of the protesters, even lowered their weapons or handed out rations. However, these small acts of compassion were overshadowed by the overwhelming force of the invasion. Elsewhere in the city, chaos reigned. Radios crackled with reports of clashes in other towns and cities, as the invasion extended beyond Prague. In Brno, students occupied university buildings, refusing to leave despite the encroaching tanks. In Bratislava, Slovak citizens took to the streets, their anger mirrored in the faces of their Czech neighbors. The solidarity of the people was undeniable, but so was the might of the Warsaw Pact forces. On the morning of August 21st, Alexander Dubček was summoned to a meeting with Soviet officials. Though he suspected the danger, he could not refuse. Accompanied by a small group of loyal colleagues, he was escorted to the headquarters of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. The atmosphere was tense, the building surrounded by Soviet troops. It was clear that this meeting would not end in compromise. Inside, Dubček confronted the Soviet envoys, who demanded the immediate rollback of his reforms and the resignation of his government. His refusal was resolute but calm. Czechoslovakia belongs to its people, he declared. We will decide our path. His defiance, though noble, sealed his fate. The Soviets, unwilling to tolerate further resistance, ordered his immediate arrest. Dubček and his colleagues were forced into military vehicles and taken to an undisclosed location. As news of their capture spread, the mood in Prague shifted from defiance to despair. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding the release of their leaders. The broadcasts of the reformist government were silenced, replaced by Soviet-controlled announcements urging calm and cooperation. Despite the blow to their leadership, the people of Czechoslovakia refused to yield. In the absence of Dubček, local leaders stepped forward, organizing protests and strikes. The invasion had not broken the spirit of the Prague Spring, it had only deepened the resolve of those who believed in its ideals. Yet, the question loomed, how long could they hold out against the full force of the Warsaw Pact? Prague, once a bustling and lively city, transformed into a landscape of occupation. Soviet tanks and armored vehicles lined the streets, their imposing presence a grim reminder of the forces now in control. Soldiers patrolled the city, their faces a mix of determination and unease. Despite the military occupation, the city's spirit remained unbroken. Acts of resistance continued, both large and small, as the people of Prague found ways to defy their occupiers. Graffiti became a weapon of choice for the frustrated and defiant. Messages such as "Moscow is not our master" and "Freedom for Czechoslovakia" appeared on walls and tanks alike. Citizens used homemade leaflets to spread messages of solidarity and resistance, while some even risked their lives to sabotage Soviet vehicles. The soldiers, expecting to restore order quickly, found themselves trapped in a city that rejected their presence at every turn. The Soviet leadership had underestimated the resilience of the Czechoslovak people. Their attempts to install a puppet government were met with widespread disdain. Those who accepted positions of power under Soviet authority were ostracized by their communities, their names scrawled on lists of shame that circulated among the population. Resistance was not just an act of courage, it was a duty shared by nearly everyone. Outside Prague, the situation was no less tense. In smaller towns and villages, local leaders organized strikes and protests, often facing brutal crackdowns. The countryside, far from the media spotlight, became a battleground for control, with Soviet forces trying to suppress the growing resistance. The will of the people was clear, they would not accept foreign domination, no matter the cost. Amid the chaos, radio broadcasts emerged as a lifeline for the resistance. Although the Soviets had taken control of many official stations, underground networks sprang up, using hidden transmitters to deliver messages of hope and defiance. These broadcasts, often operating under the cover of night, provided updates on the invasion, shared stories of resistance, and rallied the people to continue their struggle. In one such broadcast, a young journalist named Eva delivered an impassioned speech from a hidden studio on the outskirts of Prague. Her voice, calm but resolute, carried across the airwaves, "To our brothers and sisters across Czechoslovakia, do not lose hope. The spirit of the Prague Spring lives on in each of us. They may occupy our streets, but they will never conquer our hearts." Eva's broadcasts became legendary, inspiring citizens to continue their acts of defiance. Students took to the streets with renewed vigor, organizing sit-ins and peaceful demonstrations. Factory workers staged walkouts, halting production in protest of the occupation. Even farmers, far from the cities, found ways to resist by refusing to supply food to Soviet troops. The resistance was not without its costs. Soviet forces responded with increasing brutality, arresting protesters and raiding homes suspected of harboring dissenters. Yet, for every person silenced, 10 more rose to take their place. The people of Czechoslovakia had seen a glimpse of freedom, and they were unwilling to let it slip away. Across Czechoslovakia, acts of resistance took many forms, some of them bold and public, others quiet but equally impactful. The youth of Prague and other cities became the architects of sabotage, using their creativity to disrupt the invaders without resorting to violence. They switched road signs to mislead Soviet troops, covered military vehicles with paint and slogans, and disabled tanks by filling their exhaust pipes with debris. In the industrial hubs, workers coordinated slowdowns in production. Factories deemed critical to the Soviet supply chain mysteriously experienced delays and breakdowns. Train engineers intentionally disrupted schedules, causing chaos in the transport of troops and resources. These silent saboteurs operated under constant threat, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. Yet, their actions sent a clear message: the spirit of Czechoslovakia was unyielding. In one notable instance, a group of students managed to hijack a Soviet propaganda broadcast, replacing it with a recording of the Czechoslovak national anthem. The broadcast aired in the early evening, reaching thousands of homes. For a fleeting moment, the anthem's stirring melody reminded citizens that the invaders could control their streets but not their identity. The Soviet response was swift and severe, but the act had already achieved its purpose, reigniting hope in the hearts of many. Even in rural villages, resistance took root. Farmers refused to cooperate with Soviet requisition teams, hiding food supplies and livestock. Local priests offered refuge to those fleeing persecution, and community leaders coordinated efforts to shield dissidents from harm. Though the odds were overwhelmingly against them, these small, quiet acts of defiance proved that the soul of the nation remained intact. As the occupation dragged on, cracks began to appear within the ranks of the invading forces. Many Soviet soldiers, young and far from home, were troubled by what they saw in Czechoslovakia. They had been told they were entering the country to prevent a counter-revolution, yet they encountered peaceful protesters, families pleading for freedom, and children holding flowers instead of weapons. One soldier, Ivan, found himself questioning his orders after an encounter with a young boy in Prague. The child approached Ivan's tank, offering a hand-drawn picture of a dove. "Why are you here?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Ivan had no answer. That night, he confided in his comrades, and to his surprise, many shared his doubts. They spoke in hushed tones about the futility of their mission and the humanity of the people they were ordered to suppress. These internal conflicts extended to the higher ranks as well. Reports of low morale and desertions began to circulate among Soviet commanders. In some instances, entire units refused to carry out orders, citing the unjust nature of the invasion. Though these acts of defiance were rare, they reflected the growing disillusionment within the occupying forces. In Moscow, Brezhnev and his advisors worked to maintain control, issuing strict directives to quash dissent among their troops. But the fractures were undeniable. The propaganda machine struggled to keep pace with the reality on the ground. For every narrative of liberating Czechoslovakia, there were countless stories of soldiers questioning their purpose. The seeds of doubt had been planted, even within the invaders themselves. By late August, the scattered acts of defiance across Czechoslovakia began to take on a more organized form. Leaders of various resistance movements started coordinating efforts, establishing secret networks to communicate and plan their next moves. Underground printing presses churned out leaflets and newsletters, spreading messages of unity and calling for continued non-violent resistance. These publications carried a simple but powerful message: we will not be silenced. In Prague, students formed committees to organize protests and coordinate with factory workers and intellectuals. The city's universities became hubs of resistance, where plans were drawn and strategies debated. Meanwhile, in Bratislava, Slovak leaders emphasized the importance of national unity, urging their compatriots to stand with their Czech brothers and sisters. Despite cultural and linguistic differences, the people of Czechoslovakia were united in their determination to resist. One of the most notable acts of resistance came from the Czechoslovak radio, which had managed to evade complete Soviet control. Broadcasting from hidden locations, the radio provided critical updates, played patriotic songs, and read letters from citizens recounting their experiences under occupation. For many, these broadcasts were a lifeline, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. The Soviets, aware of the growing coordination among the resistance, intensified their efforts to crush dissent. Raids on suspected meeting places became more frequent, and curfews were enforced with brutal efficiency. Yet, these actions only served to strengthen the resolve of the Czechoslovak people. Each raid, each arrest, became a rallying cry for those who refused to surrender their dreams of freedom. As the resistance gained momentum, the cost of defiance grew heavier. The Soviet response became increasingly ruthless, with arrests, beatings, and even executions carried out to instill fear among the population. Families were torn apart as loved ones disappeared in the dead of night, taken to unknown locations. The prisons filled with students, workers, and intellectuals who had dared to speak out. In Prague, a young protester named Jana became a symbol of the resistance after being arrested during a peaceful demonstration in Wenceslas Square. Her bravery in the face of Soviet interrogators inspired others to continue their fight. Stories of her defiance spread across the country, and her name became a rallying cry for those who refused to bow to oppression. For Jana, they would chant during protests, their voices echoing through the streets. Despite the hardships, the resistance persisted. Families supported one another, sharing food and resources when times grew desperate. Underground networks smuggled supplies and information to those in need, ensuring that the movement could continue. The bonds of community grew stronger as people leaned on one another for strength and solace. The international community began to take notice of the human cost of the invasion. Photographs and reports of the atrocities committed by Soviet forces leaked out, drawing condemnation from around the world. While some governments hesitated to act for fear of provoking the Soviets, others voiced their support for the Czechoslovak people. Protesters in cities as far away as Paris and New York marched in solidarity, their banners proclaiming, "Hands off Czechoslovakia." The Corfu Channel Incident, a historical retelling. The year was 1946, a time when the echoes of World War II still reverberated across Europe. Nations struggled to rebuild their shattered lands, while distrust lingered like a dense fog over diplomatic relations. The Ionian Sea, filled with deceptive calmness, bore witness to an unfolding drama that would test the fragile peace. Against this backdrop, the Corfu Channel incident emerged as a stark reminder that even in peacetime, danger lurked in the shadows of maritime boundaries. The narrow channel between the Greek island of Corfu and Albania became a stage for an international confrontation. British warships, conducting routine passage through these strategic waters, encountered an explosive situation that would lead to deaths, political tensions, and ultimately, a landmark legal case. As the story of the Corfu Channel incident unfolds, it reveals not only the human cost of war but also the enduring complexities of international diplomacy. The HMS Saumarez and HMS Volage cut through the sparkling blue waters of the Ionian Sea on October 22, 1946. The British ships, sleek and formidable, bore the scars of recent battles but sailed now in a time of uneasy peace. Their mission was straightforward: assert the right of innocent passage through the Corfu Channel, a route historically recognized under international law. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom, yet the sailors aboard the vessels felt a tension in the air. Whispers of mines in the channel had reached British naval intelligence, but no one could confirm the danger. Captain Mark D. G. Menksy Townsend of the HMS Saumarez remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. Nearby, Captain Arthur C. Boville of the HMS Volage mirrored his cautious determination. The waters appeared tranquil, but beneath the surface, danger lurked. The Albanian government, under the tight control of Enver Hoxha, had expressed hostility toward foreign ships entering its claimed territorial waters. Tensions simmered as the British Navy navigated the channel, their movements closely monitored by watchful Albanian eyes on the coast. As the ships advanced, the crew prepared for the unexpected. Lookouts remained at their posts, scanning for signs of mines or enemy vessels. The sailors, many of whom were young and recently recruited, felt a mix of anticipation and unease. They understood the strategic importance of their mission but could not shake the feeling that the calm waters hid a sinister threat. The serenity of the Ionian Sea was shattered in an instant. Without warning, a thunderous explosion rocked the HMS Saumarez, sending a column of water and debris skyward. The force of the blast was deafening, and the ship lurched violently as flames erupted from its hull. Sailors scrambled to their stations, shouting orders and assisting wounded comrades. The Volage, trailing close behind, immediately moved to assist. Captain Boville ordered his crew to prepare for rescue operations, but as they maneuvered closer, disaster struck again. A second mine detonated beneath the Volage, causing significant damage to its bow. The explosion tore through the ship, sending shrapnel flying and injuring several crew members. Chaos reigned as the two ships, both heavily damaged, struggled to stay afloat. The calm sea was now a battlefield, littered with debris and the cries of wounded sailors. Despite the chaos, the crews displayed remarkable resilience. Men worked tirelessly to extinguish fires, secure the ships, and tend to the injured. The naval training instilled in them during the war years proved invaluable in this moment of crisis. From the Albanian coast, observers watched the unfolding drama with a mix of suspicion and apprehension. The British Navy's presence in these waters was seen as a provocation, and the explosions only heightened tensions. The sailors aboard the Saumarez and Volage, however, had no time for political calculations. Their focus was survival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the sea, the true extent of the damage became apparent. The Saumarez was barely operational, its hull breached and fires smoldering. The Volage, though in slightly better condition, had suffered significant structural damage. Together, the two ships limped toward the safety of Corfu, escorted by additional British vessels that had been dispatched to assist. The injured were transferred to medical facilities on the island, their wounds a grim testament to the unseen menace that lay beneath the waters. The sailors who survived carried with them not only physical scars but also the psychological weight of the day's events. For many, This incident felt like an unwelcome echo of the war they thought had ended. In London, news of the explosions sparked outrage. The British government, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, demanded answers. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin called for an immediate investigation, and attention turned to Albania, whose waters the channel bordered. The question of accountability loomed large, setting the stage for a diplomatic standoff. In the quiet moments following the ordeal, the sailors reflected on their ordeal. Some found solace in camaraderie, while others wrestled with the haunting memories of the explosions. Unbeknownst to them, their experiences would soon become part of a larger story, one that would reach the highest levels of international justice. The British government wasted no time in addressing the incident. Foreign Secretary Bevin delivered a stern message to Albania, demanding an explanation for the explosions. In Tirana, Enver Hoxha and his advisors met the British accusations with defiance. They denied any responsibility for the mines and accused Britain of violating Albanian sovereignty by entering their territorial waters without permission. As diplomatic notes flew between London and Tirana, the international community watched with growing interest. The Corfu Channel incident was not just a bilateral dispute, it had implications for international law and the balance of power in the post-war world. The United Nations, still in its infancy, became a potential forum for resolving the crisis. Meanwhile, the British Navy conducted a preliminary investigation. Divers scoured the channel, carefully retrieving fragments of the mines. Their findings pointed to deliberate placement, suggesting the mines had been laid recently and with precision. The evidence fueled British claims that Albania had acted aggressively and intentionally. At sea, tensions remained high. British warships patrolled the area, their crews on edge. For the sailors who had survived the explosions, the sight of the Corfu Channel brought back painful memories. They knew that their ordeal was far from over. The political and legal battles ahead would determine not only the fate of their ships but also the broader question of justice and accountability. In the aftermath of the incident, Britain intensified its efforts to uncover the truth. Naval intelligence teams analyzed the recovered mine fragments, tracing their origin to Soviet designs. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the case, as it hinted at broader geopolitical involvement. The Cold War was in its early stages, and the possibility of Soviet complicity raised alarms in Western capitals. The British government sought the support of its allies, emphasizing the need for a united front against aggression. France and the United States expressed cautious backing, while other nations called for a thorough investigation before assigning blame. The United Nations Security Council convened to discuss the incident, marking one of the first major tests of the organization's ability to mediate international disputes. In the waters near Corfu, British divers continued their work, mapping the minefield and documenting its layout. Their findings confirmed the dangerous extent of the threat. The channel, a vital maritime route, had been deliberately obstructed. The evidence pointed to a calculated act, designed to challenge Britain's presence in the region and assert Albanian control. For the sailors involved, the investigation offered a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. They shared their testimonies with investigators, recounting the harrowing moments of the explosions and their aftermath. Their stories became a crucial part of the case, providing a human perspective on the broader political and legal issues at stake. The diplomatic tensions surrounding the Corfu Channel incident culminated in a dramatic courtroom confrontation. In May 1947, the United Kingdom formally brought the case before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, marking the first contentious case in the court's history. The British government accused Albania of violating international law by failing to warn ships of the mines in the channel and demanded compensation for the damage caused. The court proceedings were held in The Hague, drawing attention from around the globe. Legal teams from both nations presented their arguments with precision and fervor. Britain relied on extensive evidence, including mine fragments and detailed maps, to demonstrate that the mines were deliberately placed. Albania, on the other hand, denied responsibility, arguing that the British Navy had violated its sovereignty by entering its waters without prior notice. As the hearings progressed, the ICJ faced the challenge of balancing legal principles with the geopolitical realities of the time. The Cold War's shadow loomed large over the case, influencing the perspectives of both the judges and the international community. The court's decision would set a precedent for the interpretation of international law in an increasingly divided world. For the sailors who had survived the incident, the legal battle was both a source of hope and frustration. They followed the proceedings from afar, eager for justice but wary of the slow pace of international diplomacy. The memories of their ordeal remained vivid, serving as a reminder of the human cost of the decisions being debated in The Hague. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, convened amidst great anticipation. Delegates, diplomats, and reporters from across the globe filled the courtroom in The Hague, each awaiting the resolution of the Corfu Channel incident. On April 9, 1949, after months of deliberation, the court was ready to deliver its judgment. The tension in the room was palpable as President Bastevant of the ICJ began to read the decision. The court ruled that Albania bore responsibility for the mines in the Corfu Channel. It found that the Albanian government had failed in its duty to warn passing ships of the danger and had knowingly allowed the mines to be laid within its territorial waters. However, the ICJ also addressed Britain's actions, stating that the Royal Navy's initial passage through the channel was lawful but that their subsequent evidence-gathering missions, conducted without Albanian consent, constituted a breach of sovereignty. The judgment was a landmark moment in international law, reaffirming the principles of territorial integrity and the right of innocent passage. Albania was ordered to pay compensation to the United Kingdom for the damages sustained by the HMS Saumarez and HMS Volage. The decision set a precedent for future disputes, demonstrating the role of the ICJ in mediating conflicts between nations. For the sailors who had lived through the explosions, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Their ordeal had not been in vain. Their experiences had contributed to a case that would shape international law. Still, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained, serving as a reminder of the day when peace turned deadly in the waters of the Ionian Sea. The ICJ's ruling sent shockwaves through the international community. For Britain, the verdict was a diplomatic victory, reaffirming its position as a defender of maritime law. The compensation awarded by the court, though symbolic compared to the cost of the ships and lives lost, was seen as a validation of Britain's claims. In Albania, however, the response was far less conciliatory. Enver Hoxha's regime rejected the court's judgment, portraying it as a product of Western bias. Propaganda painted the incident as a heroic stand against imperialism, rallying the Albanian people around their government's defiance. The compensation remained unpaid, further straining relations between the two nations. The broader geopolitical implications of the case also came into focus. The involvement of Soviet-designed mines raised concerns in the West about the extent of Soviet influence in Albania. For the emerging NATO alliance, the incident underscored the need to monitor the activities of communist states closely. The Corfu Channel incident became a small but significant piece in the larger puzzle of Cold War tensions. Despite the unresolved tensions, the case inspired hope for the fledgling United Nations system. The ICJ's handling of the dispute demonstrated that international law could provide a framework for resolving conflicts, even in a deeply divided world. The Corfu Channel incident became a case study in the power and limitations of diplomacy and justice. In the quiet aftermath of the ICJ ruling, the sailors of the HMS Saumarez and Volage began piecing their lives back together. For many, the memories of October 22, 1946, remain vivid, a cacophony of explosions, the screams of injured comrades, and the eerie silence that followed. These men, whose courage had turned the tide of disaster into survival, were now navigating the personal battles of recovery. Lieutenant George Thompson, who had served aboard the Saumarez, struggled with survivor's guilt. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't forget the faces of the men lost that day. Every medal he polished felt like a burden rather than an honor. Across the channel, Petty Officer Alan Reed of the Volage threw himself into his work at a naval dockyard, finding solace in the rhythm of repairing ships like the one that had saved his life. Their stories, though deeply personal, became emblematic of the human toll of the Corfu Channel incident. Veterans groups rallied to support the injured and their families, ensuring they received recognition and assistance. Meanwhile, accounts from the sailors were collected and preserved, offering future generations a first-hand glimpse into the horrors and heroism of that fateful day. As years passed, the sailors' bonds deepened. Reunions were held, where laughter mixed with tears, and memories were shared like precious relics. For these men, the Corfu Channel was more than a geographical location, it was a chapter of their lives, forever etched in their hearts. In Albania, Enver Hoxha's government continued to reject the ICJ's ruling. The regime portrayed the court's decision as an unjust imposition by Western powers, a narrative that resonated with a population still wary of foreign influence. Within the tightly controlled borders of Albania, dissenting voices were silenced, and the official version of events was propagated through every available medium. Hoxha used the incident to bolster his claims of sovereignty and resistance against perceived imperialism. In schools, children were taught that the Corfu Channel incident was a victory for Albania, a moment when a small nation stood against the might of the British Empire. Monuments commemorating the defense of Albanian waters appeared in coastal towns, reinforcing the narrative of defiance. Yet, behind closed doors, cracks in the regime's story began to show. Some officials questioned the wisdom of refusing to engage with the international community, warning that Albania's isolation could have long-term consequences. Their concerns fell on deaf ears. Hoxha's grip on power remained unshakable, and dissent was met with swift reprisals. For Albania's people, the truth of the Corfu Channel incident remained elusive. What filtered through the state-controlled press was a carefully curated version of events, designed to serve the regime's interests. The outside world seemed distant, and the complexities of international law and diplomacy were reduced to slogans and speeches. As the Cold War deepened, the Corfu Channel incident took on a new significance. Western intelligence agencies scrutinized the event for clues about Soviet-Albanian relations. The mines recovered from the channel, identified as Soviet in origin, fueled suspicions of broader communist involvement in the incident. While direct evidence of Soviet complicity remained elusive, the possibility shaped NATO's strategic thinking in the region. For Albania, its alignment with the Soviet Union brought economic and military support but also increased scrutiny from Western powers. The incident became a pretext for heightened naval operations in the Mediterranean, as NATO sought to assert control over critical maritime routes. British and American warships patrolled the region with renewed vigilance, their presence a reminder that the lessons of the Corfu Channel incident had not been forgotten. The incident also influenced naval doctrine. The dangers of mine warfare, vividly demonstrated in the Ionian Sea, prompted advances in mine detection and removal technology. The Royal Navy, in particular, invested heavily in countermine measures, ensuring that no other ship would suffer the fate of the Saumarez and Volage. Even as the world moved forward, the Corfu Channel incident remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly peace could unravel in a world still haunted by the specter of war. While diplomats and officials debated the incident in courtrooms and governments, the fishermen of the Ionian Sea lived with its lingering effects. The mines that had wreaked havoc on British warships posed a continuous danger to local fishing vessels. Coastal communities, reliant on the sea for their livelihoods, found their daily routines shadowed by fear. In the small Albanian port town of Saran, 60-year-old Arjan Petro led a group of fishermen in clearing the waters near their docks. Armed with little more than fishing nets and iron hooks, these men risked their lives to remove debris and unexploded ordnance from their fishing grounds. Arjan, a veteran of Albania's fight for independence decades earlier, saw this as another battle, this time, against the remnants of foreign conflict. Across the channel in Corfu, Greek fishermen faced similar dangers. Reports of fishing boats striking mines became more frequent, leaving families devastated. The Greek government appealed to international authorities for assistance in demining efforts, but bureaucratic delays left the burden on the local communities. Small teams of divers, often volunteers, worked tirelessly to make the waters safe again, their efforts largely unrecognized in the broader narrative of the incident. For these coastal communities, the Corfu Channel incident was not just a geopolitical flashpoint but a deeply personal struggle. Their resilience and resourcefulness, though unsung, ensured that life in the Ionian Sea continued amidst the shadows of war. In London, the British government sought to use the ICJ's ruling to pressure Albania into compliance. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to Tirana, but their efforts were met with silence. The Albanian regime's refusal to pay the court-ordered compensation became a sticking point in international relations, symbolizing the challenges of enforcing legal judgments across ideological divides. Meanwhile, Britain's allies in NATO saw the incident as an opportunity to strengthen their maritime presence in the Mediterranean. Joint naval exercises were conducted, with the Corfu Channel serving as a symbol of Western unity against communist encroachment. For the sailors participating in these drills, the ghostly wrecks of the Saumarez and Volage stood as stark reminders of the dangers lurking beneath the surface. In the United Nations, the Corfu Channel incident sparked debates about the effectiveness of international law. Some delegates argued that the ICJ's inability to enforce its ruling highlighted the need for reforms. Others pointed to the case as proof that diplomacy, though imperfect, remained the best path to peace. The discussions were lively but inconclusive, reflecting the complexities of navigating a world divided by Cold War rivalries. As the years passed, the incident faded from the headlines but remained a point of contention in diplomatic circles. For Britain and Albania, the Corfu Channel became a symbol of unresolved grievances, a scar on the map that refused to heal. Beyond the physical devastation of the Corfu Channel incident lay a quieter tragedy, the emotional toll on the families of those involved. For the widows and children of the sailors who perished, the aftermath of the incident was marked by grief and uncertainty. In Portsmouth, home to many of the Royal Navy's personnel, memorial services were held, drawing crowds of mourners who shared in the collective loss. Sarah Henderson, whose husband William had been aboard the Immerses, struggled to explain his absence to their young son. Each bedtime story she told was a mix of hope and sorrow, weaving memories of William into a tapestry of love and loss. Across the sea in Albania, the families of local sailors faced their own challenges, caught between pride in their nation's defiance and the economic hardships that followed. The sailors who survived carried invisible wounds. Nightmares and flashbacks haunted many, while others struggled with physical injuries that limited their ability to return to active duty. The British Admiralty established support programs for veterans and their families, but resources were limited, and not everyone received the help they needed. These unseen casualties of the Corfu Channel incident added a human dimension to the geopolitical drama. Their stories, though rarely told in official histories, served as poignant reminders of the cost of conflict, both on the battlefield and beyond. In the wake of the Corfu Channel incident, the Royal Navy intensified efforts to locate and neutralize the remaining mines in the Ionian Sea. Mine clearance operations became a high-stakes endeavor, requiring both skill and bravery. The HMS Pelican, a British minesweeper, was dispatched to the area, its crew acutely aware of the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Ted" Collins led the mission. A seasoned officer, he had faced the perils of underwater mines during World War II. However, this operation was different. The political tension surrounding the Corfu Channel added an extra layer of urgency. Every decision Ted made carried not only the weight of his crew's safety but also the potential to reignite international disputes. The minesweepers employed acoustic and magnetic techniques to detect and neutralize the mines. Days were long, filled with the hum of sonar equipment and the tense anticipation of a possible detonation. Divers played a crucial role, descending into the murky depths to manually disarm explosives. Among them was able seaman Michael Carver, whose steady hands and calm demeanor made him a trusted member of the team. After weeks of painstaking effort, the HMS Pelican cleared a significant portion of the channel, allowing safe passage for commercial and military vessels. The crew's success was a testament to their courage and expertise, but the mission also underscored the enduring risks of mine warfare. For Ted and his team, the relief of a job well done was tempered by the knowledge that many other waters remained treacherous. As the years passed, the Corfu Channel incident took on different meanings depending on where it was remembered. In Britain, it became a symbol of the Royal Navy's resilience and a reminder of the dangers of navigating contested waters. Naval academies incorporated the incident into their curricula, emphasizing the strategic and legal lessons it offered. In Albania, however, the narrative remained one of defiance. State-controlled media continued to celebrate the heroic defense of Albanian sovereignty, omitting any mention of the ICJ ruling or the international condemnation that followed. Monuments commemorating the event stood as silent witnesses to the regime's propaganda, their inscriptions telling a one-sided story. The incident also found its way into Cold War rhetoric. Western powers cited it as evidence of communist aggression, while the Eastern Bloc framed it as an example of imperial overreach. The truth of the event, complex and multifaceted, was often overshadowed by the ideological battles of the time. For the sailors and civilians who had lived through the incident, these grand narratives felt distant and impersonal. Their memories were shaped not by politics but by the raw realities of loss, survival, and resilience. Each anniversary of the incident brought a mix of emotions: pride in their sacrifices, sorrow for what was lost, and a quiet hope that history would not repeat itself. By the 1960s, the Corfu Channel incident had faded from the forefront of international attention, but its shadows linger. The Ionian Sea, once a bustling corridor of trade and travel, remained a site of caution. Mariners continued to share tales of the mines, their stories blending fact and folklore into a haunting narrative of a sea turned deadly. In Albania, the regime's isolationist policies deepened, cutting the nation off from much of the outside world. Enver Hoxha's government maintained its defiant stance, refusing to acknowledge or address the unresolved issues stemming from the incident. The lack of closure left a lingering tension between Albania and its neighbors, a quiet reminder of the scars left by conflict. For the families of the sailors, the memories remained vivid. Sarah Henderson, now a grandmother, kept a box of her husband William's letters and photographs. She would often share stories of his bravery with her grandchildren, ensuring his legacy endured. Across the channel, in Saran, Arjan Petro's descendants carried on his work, teaching new generations about the perils and resilience of life by the sea. The Corfu Channel incident, though no longer a headline, remained a chapter in the shared history of the region. Its lessons, about the fragility of peace, the cost of conflict, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, continued to resonate, even as the world moved forward. Operation PB Fortune, a covert CIA mission to destabilize Guatemala's government in 1952, setting the stage for Cold War-era interventions in Latin America. The year was 1952, and the world was divided by an invisible line. On one side stood the promises of democracy and liberty, on the other loomed the specter of communism. This division defined the geopolitics of the Cold War, where fear often overshadowed reason. In the heart of Central America, a small nation became the stage for a larger global confrontation. Guatemala, with its rolling highlands and fertile valleys, had dared to dream of reform and equality under the leadership of Jacobo Arbenz. But dreams can be dangerous. Arbenz' vision for land redistribution, encapsulated in Decree 900, threatened not just the entrenched elite of Guatemala but also the vast economic interests of the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation. The company, with deep ties to Washington, sounded the alarm. Accusations of communism were whispered in halls of power, growing louder until they reached the ears of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thus began Operation PB Fortune, otherwise known as Operation Fortune, a covert plan to topple a government that dared to defy the status quo. Backed by a coalition of dictators from neighboring nations, this operation marked the start of a shadow war that would leave no one untouched. In this story, we will follow the twists and turns of history through the eyes of many, the reformers, the soldiers, the farmers, and the spies. Their lives, interwoven with the tumult of their time, form the tapestry of a nation's struggle and the wider world's ambitions. It began with land, an unassuming foundation for what would become a revolution. For centuries, Guatemala's wealthiest landowners, supported by foreign corporations like the United Fruit Company, had controlled vast estates while peasants toiled in near-feudal conditions. The inequity had long simmered beneath the surface, but by the 1940s, discontent began to boil over. Manuel Estrada Cabrera and Jorge Ubico, former presidents, had ruled with iron fists, granting generous concessions to foreign businesses while suppressing the indigenous population and laborers. Under Ubico, Guatemala became a police state, where resistance was met with brutal crackdowns. But in 1944, the winds of change swept across the nation. Inspired by movements elsewhere, university students, labor unions, and progressive thinkers joined forces, forcing Ubico to resign. Among those who rose to prominence during this period was Jacobo Arbenz, a young military officer who believed in democracy and reform. Alongside other revolutionaries, He helped overthrow a military junta in the October Revolution of 1944. This victory ushered in a new era, with Juan José Arevalo elected as Guatemala's first democratically chosen leader. Arevalo implemented social reforms, including literacy programs and workers' rights, setting the stage for even more ambitious changes. When Arbenz took office in 1951, he was determined to address the most pressing issue, land. With over two-thirds of Guatemala's arable land owned by a handful of elites and corporations, he introduced Decree 900. This sweeping agrarian reform aimed to redistribute unused land to impoverished farmers, offering them a chance at self-sufficiency. The program was wildly popular among the rural poor but sparked outrage among the elite and foreign corporations like the United Fruit Company, whose holdings were directly affected. Unbeknownst to Arbenz, these changes were drawing the attention of powerful forces far beyond Guatemala's borders. In Washington, the word "communist" began to echo ominously in discussions about his government. The stage was set for intervention, and the seeds of conflict had been sown. In the quiet halls of Washington, D.C., Arbenz's reforms were interpreted as something more sinister. To the CIA and the State Department, his land redistribution program resembled communist infiltration, even though Arbenz himself denied any such allegiance. The Cold War's paranoia magnified every reform into a potential threat. At the heart of this concern was the United Fruit Company, whose sprawling plantations made it the largest landowner in Guatemala. United Fruit wielded influence far beyond the fields of bananas it controlled. It had friends in high places, politicians, lobbyists, and even former employees who now worked in the U.S. government. The company painted Arbenz's government as a communist menace, using its connections to amplify its claims. This narrative resonated in the corridors of the CIA, where Director Walter Bedell Smith and his deputy, Alan Dulles, began formulating a response. In secret meetings, officials discussed the possibility of a coup. They reasoned that Arbenz's reforms threatened not just United Fruit's profits but also the region's stability. The Monroe Doctrine had long justified U.S. intervention in the Americas, and now the specter of communism added urgency. The plan that emerged was codenamed Operation Fortune. The operation would rely on exiled Guatemalan military officer Carlos Castillo Armas, who had fled the country after falling out with Arbenz. Castillo Armas was charismatic and ambitious, and the CIA believed he could rally forces against the Guatemalan government. They began supplying him with weapons, funding, and training, using neighboring countries as staging grounds. Anastasio Somoza Garcia of Nicaragua, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, and Marcos Pérez Jiménez of Venezuela offered their support, viewing Arbenz's democratic reforms as a threat to their own authoritarian regimes. The storm was gathering, and in the shadows, a conspiracy was taking shape. Carlos Castillo Armas stared at the map spread across the table, his finger tracing the route his forces would take. A man of ambition and conviction, he had been waiting for this moment. Exile had not dulled his military instincts, and now, with U.S. support, he saw an opportunity to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The CIA operatives briefing him were seasoned professionals, their calm demeanor masking the enormity of their plans. They spoke in measured tones about logistics, weapons, and timing. The weapons supplied by the U.S. were being funneled through Nicaragua, and Castillo Armas's ragtag army was growing stronger by the day. His forces, while limited in number, were bolstered by promises of external support and the hope that discontented elements within Guatemala's military would join the cause. Meanwhile, in Managua, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the dictator of Nicaragua, played a dangerous game. He was a willing accomplice in the plot, providing safe haven and resources for the operation. Yet, Somoza's motivations were far from ideological. He sought to eliminate a nearby example of democracy that might inspire his own people to rise against him. Farther afield, Rafael Trujillo and Marcos Pérez Jiménez lent their support, offering funds and moral backing. Their authoritarian regimes were united in their fear of Guatemala's revolutionary example. Democracy, even in its nascent form, was anathema to their rule, and they were determined to see Arbenz overthrown. As these players assembled their resources and resolved their plans, the ordinary people of Guatemala remained unaware of the storm about to descend on their nation. As the conspirators solidified their plans, word of the operation began to spread in the murky corridors of international intrigue. In Guatemala City, whispers of an imminent plot reached the ears of Arbenz's government. The intelligence trickled in piecemeal, rumors of weapons shipments, meetings between exiles, and foreign interference. The president's inner circle grew tense, knowing that danger lurked just beyond the horizon. Arbenz was no stranger to the precarious position of his government. Since the revolution, his reforms had faced resistance from powerful elites and foreign interests. Yet, he believed in the righteousness of his mission. To him, Decree 900 was not just a policy but a moral imperative. The land reform was returning dignity to the country's most disenfranchised citizens, creating hope where there had only been despair. Meanwhile, across the border in Nicaragua, Castillo Armas's forces were making final preparations. Their ragged uniforms and borrowed equipment spoke of a rebellion cobbled together hastily, but morale was high. Each soldier carried the hope of victory, fueled by Castillo Armas's impassioned speeches and the promise of U.S. support. In Washington, officials debated the risks of exposure. The plan relied on secrecy, but the growing network of collaborators made leaks inevitable. Secretary of State Dean Acheson began voicing concerns. He feared the operation could backfire, damaging the United States' image as a defender of democracy. But for the CIA, the objective was clear: Arbenz had to be stopped, no matter the cost. In Guatemala's highlands, the farmers who had received land through the reforms worked under the shadow of uncertainty. News of foreign threats was slow to reach these rural areas, but tension lingered in the air. They had fought for decades to gain a semblance of ownership over their lives, and now that ownership was at risk. As May 1952 arrived, a pivotal moment in the operation's timeline, Arbenz's government enacted Decree 900. Over 500,000 Guatemalan peasants benefited from this agrarian reform, receiving land to cultivate. The sight of families planting crops on fields they could finally call their own became a symbol of the revolution's success. But for the United Fruit Company, it was a direct blow to their empire. United Fruit's executives ramped up their campaign against Arbenz, commissioning public relations efforts to portray his government as a communist front. The company's legal team flooded U.S. newspapers with stories alleging Soviet influence in Guatemala. Behind closed doors, they lobbied influential policymakers, urging intervention. To their allies in Washington, this was not just about bananas, it was about preventing the domino effect of communism in the Americas. Arbenz, aware of the mounting pressure, sought allies of his own. He turned to local unions, student groups, and international bodies to advocate for Guatemala's sovereignty. Yet, his efforts were no match for the juggernaut of United Fruit's propaganda machine. In Washington, influential figures like John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, the CIA's deputy director, supported the company's position. Both had close ties to United Fruit and believed that Arbenz government needed to be neutralized. The fracture between Guatemala and the United States grew wider with each passing day. On one side stood a small nation fighting for reform, on the other loomed a superpower unwilling to tolerate any perceived challenge to its hegemony. The fault line was growing, and soon, it would erupt. In the humid heat of a Nicaraguan airfield, a secret operation was underway. Crates of weapons, marked as agricultural supplies, were being loaded onto trucks. These shipments, bound for the forces of Carlos Castillo Armas, were a critical part of Operation Fortune. The weapons, rifles, ammunition, and grenades had been quietly procured by the CIA, ensuring plausible deniability. Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza Garcia watched the operation with satisfaction. For him, this was more than an act of support, it was a chance to solidify his relationship with the United States. Somoza understood the importance of playing his cards right. By aiding the Americans in their anti-communist crusade, he secured their backing for his own regime, ensuring his grip on power. The trucks rumbled out of the airfield, carrying their deadly cargo toward the border. In the shadows, a network of couriers, drivers, and informants ensured the operation remained hidden from prying eyes. Each step of the journey was fraught with risk. A single misstep could expose the entire plot, jeopardizing the carefully constructed plans. Back in Guatemala, Arben's government received reports of unusual movements near the border. The intelligence was vague, hinting at arms smuggling and troop buildups in neighboring Nicaragua. Arbenz ordered his military to remain vigilant, though he feared infiltration from within. Not all officers were loyal to the revolutionary cause, some still harbored allegiance to the old regimes or the exiled Castillo Armas. For the farmers working their newly acquired land, life continued as usual, though a sense of unease hung in the air. They heard rumors of unrest and foreign plots but could do little more than hope that the government would protect them. They had fought so hard for their piece of the earth, losing it now would be unthinkable. In late May, Anastasio Somoza Garcia traveled to Washington, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission. Officially, his visit was to discuss regional cooperation, but behind closed doors, the discussion centered on the covert operation against Arbenz. Somoza met with high-ranking officials in the State Department and the CIA, reassuring them of his commitment to the plan. The meetings were tense. U.S. officials sought assurances that the operation would remain secret. Somoza, ever the opportunist, used the moment to extract promises of future support for his regime. He argued that a successful overthrow in Guatemala would send a clear message to the region: democracy would not be allowed to destabilize the hemisphere. Meanwhile, Somoza's counterpart in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, was doubling down on his reforms. Unaware of the full extent of the plans against him, he focused on strengthening his administration's support among the populace. His speeches emphasized national pride and the importance of resisting foreign interference. Yet, in private moments, he confided his fears to his wife, Maria Cristina Villanova. She, in turn, became his most steadfast supporter, urging him to hold firm. Somoza's visit to Washington concluded with an implicit understanding: the operation would proceed, and the United States would remain involved behind the scenes. As he departed for Nicaragua, the dictator felt emboldened, convinced that his role in the plot would elevate his stature on the world stage. In Guatemala, the first cracks in the facade of stability began to show. Reports of internal dissent and the potential for betrayal within the military reached Arbenz's desk. The president knew that the next move would be decisive, one that could determine the future of his country. In the capital of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz sat in his office, his brow furrowed as he reviewed intelligence reports. The whispers of a plot were no longer vague rumors, they had grown into alarming patterns. Movements of arms near the border, meetings of discontented officers, and increasing anti-government propaganda hinted at a conspiracy taking shape. Arbenz's confidence in his military began to waver. Among the ranks of his officers, loyalties were divided. Some were fervent supporters of the revolutionary government, believing in its mission to uplift the nation's poor. Others, however, resented the changes that had dismantled their privileged status. For men like these, Carlos Castillo Armas's call to arms offered a path back to the old order, one where their authority remained unchallenged. Arbenz convened his closest advisors. Together, they debated how best to address the growing threat. Should they tighten security measures, risking accusations of authoritarianism? Or should they attempt to win over the disaffected factions within the military? The president ultimately decided on a dual strategy, strengthening internal defenses while continuing his public campaign of hope and reform. Meanwhile, Castillo Armas's forces continued to gather strength in Nicaragua. With Somoza's backing and the steady flow of CIA support, the exiled officer felt emboldened. He reached out to his contacts within the Guatemalan military, seeking allies willing to turn against Arbenz. Some responded positively, but others remained hesitant, weighing the risks of rebellion against the promises of reward. For the ordinary citizens of Guatemala, life carried on in an uneasy equilibrium. Farmers toiled in the fields granted to them under Decree 900, their dreams of prosperity tempered by the uncertainty of the times. In the cities, labor unions and student groups rallied in support of the government, their chants filling the streets. Yet, even as they raised their voices, the specter of betrayal loomed ever closer. In a dimly lit room in Managua, Carlos Castillo Armas held a meeting with a small group of his most trusted supporters. The mood was tense but determined. Spread out before them were maps of Guatemala, marked with the routes of their planned invasion. Castillo Armas spoke with conviction, his voice steady as he outlined the next steps. "We have the weapons, the men, and the will," he said, his finger tracing the planned incursion route. "What we need now is precision. Every move must be calculated, every ally must be certain. We cannot afford failure." His words resonated with the group, many of whom had sacrificed much to be part of this cause. Among them was an informant who had recently returned from Guatemala with reports of the government's growing unease. According to the informant, Arbenz's military was divided, with some officers secretly supporting the insurgents. As Castillo Armas planned, the CIA operatives overseeing the operation grew increasingly cautious. The risk of exposure loomed large, especially as rumors of the plot began to reach Washington. Dean Acheson, the U.S. Secretary of State, remained deeply uneasy about the operation's potential consequences. He worried that an overt coup would tarnish America's reputation, undermining its claims of championing democracy during the Cold War. Back in Guatemala City, Arbenz held a late-night meeting with his inner circle. The reports of military discontent weighed heavily on him, as did the rumors of foreign interference. Maria Cristina, always by his side, urged him to stay the course. "We cannot allow fear to dictate our actions," she told him. "The people believe in you. You must not abandon them now." As the night deepened, decisions were made on both sides. In Managua, Castillo Armas's forces prepared for their next move. In Guatemala City, Arbenz issued orders to bolster the capital's defenses. Unbeknownst to either side, the decisive moment was drawing nearer, and the fates of many hung in the balance. As Operation Fortune advanced, the battle for Guatemala was no longer confined to weapons and soldiers. A war of words raged alongside it. The United Fruit Company, with its extensive resources, orchestrated a propaganda campaign aimed at painting Arbenz as a dangerous communist sympathizer. The campaign's reach extended far beyond Guatemala, infiltrating newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even U.S. congressional hearings. In Washington, the narrative began to take root. Articles appeared in influential newspapers describing Guatemala as a Soviet foothold in the Americas. Reporters, often unwittingly repeating talking points fed to them by United Fruit's public relations team, warned of a looming threat to regional stability. For many Americans, these stories solidified the belief that Arbenz government was a puppet of Moscow, even as evidence of direct communist ties remained elusive. In Guatemala City, the propaganda machine worked in reverse. Arbenz and his allies sought to rally the population with speeches and radio broadcasts. "This is not a battle against communism," Arbenz declared in one address. "It is a fight for the sovereignty of Guatemala and the dignity of its people." His words inspired many, but they could not entirely counter the narrative spreading abroad. The propaganda war spilled into the streets of Guatemala. Flyers appeared overnight, some denouncing Arbenz as a communist, others proclaiming him a hero of the people. Students debated fervently in university halls, while workers in factories whispered about the rumors they had heard. The atmosphere grew tense, as neighbors began to view one another with suspicion. Meanwhile, within the ranks of Castillo Armas's forces, morale was bolstered by reports of their growing support among Guatemalan exiles and disaffected military officers. "The people will join us when they see the truth," Castillo Armas assured his men. But beneath his confidence lay an understanding: propaganda alone would not win the war. Action was inevitable. The dimly lit cantina was filled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. In a corner booth, a man with a weathered face sat quietly, listening. He had no name worth remembering, at least not in this place. To the patrons of the cantina, he was just another drifter, passing through. In truth, he was an agent working for the Arbenz government, tasked with uncovering the details of the plot. For weeks, the agent had infiltrated circles of discontented exiles, posing as a sympathizer. He had attended secret meetings, gaining their trust and collecting information. Now, as he sipped his drink, he overheard a snippet of conversation that sent a chill down his spine. The date of the planned invasion had been set. The agent left the cantina unnoticed, his mission clear. Within hours, he had crossed the border into Guatemala, carrying with him the critical details of Castillo Armas's plans. He relayed the information to a trusted official in Arbenz government, who immediately called for an emergency meeting. In the presidential palace, Arbenz listened intently as the report was read aloud. The details confirmed what he had feared: the insurgents were preparing to strike. The president ordered the military to reinforce border defenses and instructed his intelligence network to monitor any unusual activity within the country. "We cannot wait for them to come to us," he said. "We must be ready." But even as Arbenz acted on the new intelligence, the web of intrigue tightened around him. The United States, despite internal debates about the operation, continued to support Castillo Armas. And in the countryside, whispers of discontent began to grow louder, threatening to fracture the fragile unity of the revolutionary government. The night sky over Guatemala City was clear, but the atmosphere within the presidential palace was anything but serene. Jacobo Arbenz sat with his top military advisors, poring over maps marked with suspected invasion routes. The intelligence from the infiltrator had been precise, but it painted a grim picture. The insurgents were better armed and coordinated than initially believed. Yet, it was not just the external threat that worried Arbenz, it was the fractures within his own ranks. Reports of dissent among officers trickled in with increasing frequency. Some senior commanders questioned the president's reforms, viewing them as reckless and alienating to the military elite. Others openly resented the empowerment of the peasantry, which they saw as a disruption of the natural order. Arbenz knew the stakes. A divided military could not withstand an invasion. He summoned his most loyal generals and tasked them with identifying and addressing disloyal elements within the armed forces. The challenge was immense. Arresting suspected officers could provoke further dissent, but allowing them to remain posed an even greater risk. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the tension was palpable. Farmers who had benefited from the land reforms stood ready to defend their newfound freedoms, but they lacked weapons and formal training. In whispered conversations by candlelight, they spoke of their fears and hopes, placing their trust in Arbenz to protect them. Across the border, Castillo Armas watched these developments with growing confidence. His spies within Guatemala reported on the divisions within the military and the rising unease among the populace. The time to strike is near, he told his advisors. The cracks in their foundation are showing. Arbenz reached out to potential allies, hoping to strengthen Guatemala's position in the face of the looming threat. His first appeal was to Mexico, a neighboring country that had long maintained a wary relationship with the United States. Mexican President Miguel Alemán listened sympathetically but was hesitant to provide direct support. Mexico's own relationship with Washington was delicate, and Alemán feared provoking American retaliation. Next, Arbenz turned to the broader international community. Guatemala's representative at the United Nations gave impassioned speeches about sovereignty and non-intervention, urging member nations to condemn the actions of foreign powers conspiring against the country. While these pleas garnered some support, they were largely met with indifference. The world's attention was fixed on larger Cold War conflicts in Korea and Eastern Europe. Back in Washington, Dean Acheson continued to voice his concerns about the operation. He warned that an overt coup could backfire, potentially alienating allies in Latin America. But the CIA, led by Alan Dulles, remained resolute. The agency saw Arbenz's government as a direct challenge to American dominance in the region and was determined to see it overthrown. In Guatemala, Arbenz's efforts to rally international support were met with mixed reactions among his people. Some saw his appeals as a sign of strength, proof that their leader was fighting for them on the global stage. Others, however, viewed them as a sign of desperation, evidence that the government was faltering under pressure. The echoes of allies, real and imagined, reverberated across the nation, as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. Castillo Armas finalized his invasion plans, while Arbenz fortified his defenses. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first spark to ignite the powder keg. The borderlands of Guatemala were quiet, but the stillness was deceptive. Along the key routes where an invasion might unfold, soldiers stood watch, their nerves taut like drawn bowstrings. Arbenz's orders had been clear: the military was to repel any incursion with full force. Yet, whispers among the ranks spoke of uncertainty. The looming conflict was not just a battle for territory, it was a test of loyalty. In the towns near the border, ordinary citizens prepared in their own ways. Farmers gathered their tools, ready to defend their land if the fighting reached them. Mothers and children whispered prayers, hoping for peace but bracing for the worst. The specter of war cast its shadow over their homes, a constant reminder of how fragile their newfound stability was. Across the border in Nicaragua, Castillo Armas held a final meeting with his commanders. The men reviewed their invasion routes and discussed the expected timeline of the operation. Castillo Armas, though outwardly confident, felt the weight of the moment. This was his chance to rewrite the story of Guatemala's revolution, to seize power and restore the old order, or so he believed. In Washington, the CIA monitored the operation closely. Reports from the field were promising. Castillo Armas's forces were ready, and intelligence suggested that Arben's government was vulnerable. But the agency's leadership remained cautious. The success of Operation Fortune depended on secrecy and swift execution. Any delay or misstep could unravel the entire plan. As dawn broke over the highlands, the line between peace and war seemed thinner than ever. The soldiers at the border stood firm, their eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of movement. The clock was ticking, and everyone, soldier and civilian alike, knew it. In Guatemala City, Arbenz met with his top military advisors. The meeting room was tense, the air thick with mistrust. Reports of disloyalty within the ranks had reached a critical point, forcing the president to confront the possibility that some of his officers might side with the insurgents. Arbenz spoke calmly but firmly, addressing the gathered generals and colonels. "Our nation stands at a crossroads," he began. "What we face is not just an invasion but an attack on our sovereignty, our democracy, and the future of our people. I need to know that I can count on each of you to defend this republic." The room was silent. Some officers nodded in agreement, their faces resolute. Others avoided Arbenz's gaze, their expressions betraying their inner turmoil. Among them were men who had secretly communicated with Castillo Armas, weighing the promise of personal gain against the risks of betrayal. After the meeting, General Enrique Perrin, one of Arbenz's closest allies, approached the president. "Señor Presidente," he said quietly, "I believe we must act decisively. If there are traitors among us, we cannot afford to wait for their betrayal." Arbenz hesitated, torn between his commitment to democratic principles and the harsh realities of war. Meanwhile, within Castillo Armas's camp, plans were set into motion. The exiled officer had received assurances from key Guatemalan military contacts that they would stand down, or even defect, when his forces crossed the border. Confident in this support, Castillo Armas ordered his men to begin their march toward Guatemala. As night fell, the fractures within the Guatemalan command deepened. Soldiers in the capital whispered among themselves, wondering which of their leaders they could trust. In the countryside, rumors of betrayal added to the tension. The stage was set, and the players were ready. All that remained was the first move. The quiet dawn of early June was shattered by the rumble of trucks and the echo of marching boots. Castillo Armas's forces, a mix of trained soldiers and hastily recruited exiles, began their journey across the Nicaraguan border into Guatemala. The invasion had begun. Their goal was to seize key border towns quickly, using them as footholds to rally local support and destabilize the government. As they crossed the border, Castillo Armas addressed his men. "This is the moment we have prepared for," he declared. "We fight not just to reclaim our nation but to restore its honor. Stay strong, stay united, and we will prevail." The initial incursion went smoothly. The first Guatemalan outposts the insurgents encountered were lightly manned, and many soldiers fled without a fight, intimidated by the sheer momentum of the invaders. However, as they pushed deeper into Guatemalan territory, the resistance stiffened. In some villages, armed peasants, emboldened by the land reforms, stood their ground. Though poorly equipped, they were determined to protect the land they now called their own. In Guatemala City, news of the invasion reached the presidential palace within hours. Arbenz convened an emergency meeting of his top advisors. Maps of the border were unfurled, showing the insurgents' probable routes. General Perrin, loyal and unwavering, urged immediate retaliation. "We cannot let them gain a foothold," he said. "Every hour we wait, they grow stronger." Arbenz agreed, ordering his military to mobilize. Units were dispatched to intercept the insurgents, while additional forces were stationed in the capital to guard against potential coups. The president addressed the nation over the radio, urging calm and unity. "Guatemala faces a grave threat," he said. "But we will stand firm. This land belongs to the people, and no invader will take it from us." As Castillo Armas's forces advanced, they encountered their first significant resistance near the town of Esquipulas. Guatemalan troops, reinforced by hastily organized militias, had fortified key positions along the main road. The battle that ensued was fierce and chaotic. Machine gun fire echoed through the hills as the two sides clashed. For the insurgents, this was a critical test. Many of Castillo Armas's men were unseasoned fighters, driven more by ideology than experience. Yet, their morale was high, bolstered by the belief that they were liberators. For the Guatemalan defenders, it was a fight for survival. They knew that if Esquipulas fell, the road to the interior would be open. Despite their best efforts, the Guatemalan forces were outgunned. The insurgents, armed with superior weapons supplied by the CIA, gradually gained the upper hand. By nightfall, Esquipulas was under Castillo Armas's control. His men celebrated their victory, but Castillo Armas himself remained cautious. He knew that this was just the beginning. Back in Guatemala City, the fall of Esquipulas sent shockwaves through the government. Arbenz ordered reinforcements to the region and tightened security in the capital. He also instructed his intelligence network to uncover any internal collaborators aiding the insurgents. For the people of Guatemala, the news brought fear and uncertainty. In the countryside, peasants prepared to defend their homes, while in the cities, rumors of betrayal and foreign plots spread like wildfire. The revolution that had promised hope and change now faced its most perilous hour. The loss of Esquipulas marked a turning point in the conflict. Word of the insurgents' advance spread rapidly through Guatemala's countryside. In small towns and villages, people gathered around radios to hear the latest news, their faces tense with worry. While some saw the insurgents as liberators, others viewed them as a threat to the fragile progress that had been made under Arbenz. In Guatemala City, Arbenz worked tirelessly, coordinating with his military advisors and seeking to stabilize his government. The president had always been a symbol of hope for the poor, but now he faced growing criticism. Opposition voices, emboldened by the insurgents' successes, accused him of leading the country into chaos. Even within his inner circle, doubts began to surface. General Perrin, ever loyal, reassured Arbenz. "Señor Presidente, we still hold the upper hand. The people will support us if we can show them that we are strong." Arbenz nodded, but he knew the truth: time was not on their side. Every victory for the insurgents emboldened their supporters and weakened the morale of his own forces. Meanwhile, Castillo Armas consolidated his hold on Esquipulas, using it as a base to launch further incursions. His forces moved quickly, capturing smaller outposts and cutting supply lines. Villagers who resisted were met with swift retribution, while those who welcomed the insurgents were promised safety and prosperity under a new government. The CIA operatives observing the conflict reported back to Washington with cautious optimism. "The operation is progressing as planned," one memo read, "but local resistance remains a factor. Continued support is essential." For Arbenz and his government, the echoes of the battlefield grew louder, a reminder of the storm that threatened to engulf them. The conflict began to tear at the seams of Guatemalan society. In the countryside, peasants who had received land under Decree 900 stood ready to defend their livelihoods, armed with little more than machetes and makeshift weapons. In contrast, wealthier landowners, many of whom had lost vast tracts of land to the reforms, increasingly threw their support behind Castillo Armas. In Guatemala City, the streets were alive with tension. Students, labor unions, and progressive groups rallied in support of Arbenz, their chants echoing through the plazas. Meanwhile, opposition factions held secret meetings, discussing ways to exploit the turmoil. The city became a microcosm of the nation, a place where hopes, fears, and rivalries collided. Arbenz's government worked to maintain order, deploying troops to key locations and monitoring suspected opposition groups. But the president faced an uphill battle. The propaganda campaign waged by United Fruit and its allies had sown doubt among the urban middle class, many of whom began to question Arbenz's leadership. In a small village near the advancing front lines, a farmer named Miguel stood with his neighbors, discussing what to do if the insurgents arrived. "This land is ours now," Miguel said firmly. "We fought for it, and we will fight to keep it." His words were met with nods of agreement, but fear lingered in their eyes. They knew that resisting Castillo Armas's forces would come at a high cost. As the nation divided along lines of loyalty and ideology, the insurgents pressed their advantage. Castillo Armas, emboldened by his victories, declared that the fall of Guatemala City was inevitable. But Arbenz, despite the mounting pressure, refused to back down. "This is our fight," he told his advisors. "We will not surrender our country to fear." In the halls of the presidential palace, a heavy silence hung as Jacobo Arbenz studied the latest intelligence reports. The insurgents were advancing steadily, their forces bolstered by defectors from the Guatemalan military. Each defection was a blow, not only to his government's strength, but also to its morale. Arbenz began to question the loyalty of those closest to him. The president called a meeting of his inner circle. General Perrin, steadfast as ever, assured him that the majority of the military remained loyal. "We can still repel them, Señor Presidente," Perrin insisted. "But we must act decisively." Arbenz nodded, his face betraying the weight of leadership. He knew that his decisions in the coming days could define the fate of the revolution and the nation. Beyond the palace walls, the seeds of doubt spread among the populace. In Guatemala City, whispers of conspiracy and betrayal grew louder. Some blamed the government's reform policies for the unrest, while others pointed to foreign meddling. Among the working class, support for Arbenz remained strong, but even they could not ignore the growing uncertainty. In the countryside, the divide deepened. Some communities rallied to Arbenz's cause, forming militias to defend their homes. Others, disillusioned or intimidated, began to waver. Castillo Armas's forces capitalized on this, spreading propaganda that promised a return to stability and prosperity under their rule. At the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City, CIA operatives quietly monitored the situation. Their reports to Washington highlighted the fractures within Arbenz government and the growing momentum of the insurgents. "The operation is progressing favorably," one report read. "Internal dissent within the government is proving more effective than anticipated." As Arbenz prepared for the next phase of the conflict, he resolved to confront the growing doubt within his ranks. He understood that unity was his greatest weapon, and the lack of it his greatest vulnerability. The Guatemalan highlands became a theater of guerrilla warfare as the insurgents pushed deeper into the country. Small, scattered skirmishes erupted along narrow mountain passes and dense forests, where loyalist forces sought to slow the advance of Castillo Armas's troops. These confrontations were brutal and chaotic, fought with limited resources and no clear front lines. One such battle unfolded near the village of Zacapa. A small detachment of government soldiers, supported by local farmers, ambushed an insurgent convoy. The attack was swift and fierce, leaving several insurgents dead and scattering the rest. But the victory came at a cost. The loyalists suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat when reinforcements arrived for the insurgents. Among the defenders was a young soldier named Emilio, who had joined the army out of a sense of duty to his homeland. As he and his comrades regrouped in the forest, he couldn't shake the images of the battle. The sight of fallen friends and foes haunted him, a stark reminder of the price they were all paying. In Castillo Armas's camp, the skirmishes were seen as minor setbacks. His commanders assured him that the insurgents' overall momentum remained strong. But Castillo Armas knew that prolonged resistance in the highlands could drain his forces and delay his advance toward the capital. For Arbenz, the reports from the highlands were both heartening and troubling. The resistance of his soldiers and the peasants bolstered his resolve, but he knew that these small victories were not enough. "We must strengthen our forces," he told General Perrin. "If we are to win this fight, we need a decisive blow." As the conflict spread across the rugged terrain, the highlands became a symbol of Guatemala's struggle. Each hill and valley bore witness to the sacrifices of those who fought to protect their land, and those who sought to reclaim it.